Every major X-Men event explained, full history to sleep to. Introduction. There is a particular kind of story that keeps returning to the same question, decade after decade, no matter how much the world around it changes. The X-Men have always been that story. On the surface, they are a team of costumed heroes with extraordinary abilities, fighting robots and tyrants and cosmic forces across the pages of Marvel Comics. But underneath that surface, they have always been about something else. They have always been about the fear of what is different, and the hope that fear does not have to be the final answer. Tonight, we're going to trace that story from its earliest beginnings to its most radical modern transformation. We'll start in a world where mutants have only just begun to appear, where a young man named Charles Xavier is trying to imagine a future in which humans and mutants might live side by side. We'll follow the small group of teenagers he gathers around him, and we'll watch as that small group grows into something much larger than any of them could have predicted. We'll meet Magneto, a man shaped by the worst atrocities of the 20th century, who comes to believe that Xavier's dream is not just naive but dangerous. And we'll watch the tension between these two men echo through nearly every major event in X-Men history, long after either of them expected it to. This is a long story, and it does not move in a straight line. It moves in waves. Teams form and break apart. Villains become allies and old friends become enemies. Entire timelines are created and unraveled. Populations rise and are devastated in a single day. A team of superheroes slowly becomes something closer to a persecuted people, and eventually something closer to a nation. If you already know pieces of this story, you may find some of it familiar. If you are hearing much of it for the first time, that's fine too. The goal tonight isn't to test what you remember. It's simply to walk through it together, slowly, in order, the way a long history deserves to be told. A brief note before we begin. Marvel Comics has told this story across thousands of issues, written by dozens of different creators, and not every detail has stayed perfectly consistent over 60 years of publication. Where dates or exact issue numbers matter less than the shape of the story itself, we'll focus on the shape of the story. Where an event takes place in an alternate timeline, a possible future, or a reality that was later undone, that will always be made clear because in X-Men history, the difference between what actually happened and what almost happened is often the entire point. So settle in. Let your eyes close if you'd like. We're going to begin at the very start, before there was a Xavier school, before there was a team, in a world that was only just beginning to understand what a mutant was. Prologue before the X-Men. In the Marvel Universe, mutants are humans born with the X gene, a genetic trait that grants them superhuman abilities that typically manifest during puberty. Unlike heroes who gain their powers through accidents, experiments, or outside forces, mutants are simply born the way they are. That distinction matters enormously to the story that follows, because it means mutant identity was never something chosen. It was something discovered, usually painfully, and usually in adolescence, at the exact moment in life when feeling different is hardest to bear. By the early 1960s, when Marvel's mutant concept was first introduced, the world these characters were born into was one already familiar with the idea of a hidden, feared minority. The X-Men were created against the backdrop of the American Civil Rights Movement, and while the comics were never a direct one-to-one allegory for any specific real-world struggle, the underlying theme was unmistakable from the beginning. A group of people born different, treated with suspicion and hostility simply for existing, trying to decide how to respond to a world that did not want them. Two men would come to embody the two poles of that response. Charles Xavier was a telepath, born into wealth, who came to believe that mutants and humans could build a shared future together, if mutants were willing to prove through restraint and heroism that they were not a threat. Max Eisenhardt, who the world would come to know as Magneto, had survived the Holocaust as a child, and had watched an entire people be systematically dehumanized and destroyed long before he ever manifested a single mutant power. For Magneto, Xavier's faith in peaceful coexistence wasn't just optimistic. It was a dangerous echo of the same trust that had failed his own family a generation earlier. It's worth sitting for a moment with just how differently these two men experienced the idea of persecution before either of them had ever heard the word mutant. Xavier's early life, for all its own private sorrows, was one of privilege and possibility, a young man who could reasonably expect the world to eventually make room for him, given enough patience and enough proof of good intent. Magneto's early life offered no such reassurance. He had already watched, as a child, an entire government mobilize its full institutional power toward the systematic destruction of a people simply for existing as they were. When mutant powers eventually surfaced in wider society, and the first murmurs of anti-mutant sentiment began circulating in the press, Xavier heard an opportunity to prove himself to a skeptical world. Magneto heard something he had heard once before, and had promised himself he would never allow to happen again without a fight. The two men would meet, form an uneasy friendship, and eventually split apart over exactly this disagreement. That split would define mutant history for the next 60 years. Part I: The Original X-Men. Chapter 1: The Formation of the X-Men. Charles Xavier built his school not simply as a place to teach mutant teenagers how to control their abilities, but as an experiment in a much larger idea, that mutants could use their powers responsibly, publicly, and heroically, and that doing so might change how humanity saw them. The X-Men, in their earliest incarnation, were his students, drawn largely from troubled or isolated backgrounds, each dealing with a version of the same problem. Their bodies had changed in ways that made them targets, and Xavier offered them both a sanctuary and a purpose. The original team was small. Cyclops, whose optic blasts he could not turn off without his ruby quartz visor, became Xavier's first student and, in time, his most devoted follower. Jean Grey, a telepath and telekinetic still learning the boundaries of her own mind, joined shortly after. Beast, whose enhanced strength and agility were paired with an unusually large intellect, brought a scientific curiosity to the team that would define his character for decades. Angel, born with functioning wings, was the team's wealthy playboy, drawn to the X-Men more out of restlessness than ideology. And Iceman, the youngest of the group, brought a certain reckless humor that balanced out Cyclops' rigidity. Cyclops' particular relationship with Xavier deserves special mention here, since it would go on to shape decades of future storytelling. Having grown up largely in orphanages and foster care after losing his family in a plane crash during childhood, Cyclops arrived at Xavier's school with little experience of stability or unconditional support. Xavier became, for him, not simply a mentor but something closer to the first adult who had ever consistently shown up for him. And that early bond helps explain why Cyclops would remain so fiercely loyal to Xavier's vision even decades later, long after other X-Men had grown more willing to question or diverge from it. Xavier positioned the team publicly as heroes, but privately, their mission was broader. He wanted them ready for a moment he feared was coming, a moment when mutants and humans would be forced to choose between coexistence and conflict, and he wanted the X-Men to be proof that coexistence was possible. The school itself, a mansion in Westchester, New York, functioned as both a home and a training ground, and that dual purpose mattered enormously to how these characters were written. Unlike most superhero teams, who typically operated as adults choosing a costumed life, the original X-Men were minors, sent to Xavier often by families who did not know how else to handle a child whose body had suddenly and irreversibly changed. Some, like Cyclops, arrived with painful histories of institutional neglect. Others, like Angel, came from wealth and privilege but found that money offered no protection from a world that judged them by their wings rather than their bank accounts. Xavier's role was as much guardian and father figure as it was general and strategist, and that tension between raising children and preparing soldiers, would recur throughout X-Men history in one form or another for decades. Chapter 2. The Early Conflict with Magneto. Magneto's earliest confrontations with the X-Men were framed simply, almost like any other supervillain story. A powerful mutant with control over magnetism, using his abilities for personal gain and dominance, opposed by a team of young heroes. But even in these early appearances, the philosophical seed was already there. Magneto did not see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a realist, someone unwilling to wait for humanity he did not trust to eventually accept mutants on its own timeline. Xavier and Magneto's earliest meetings, later expanded upon in flashback stories, revealed that the two men had actually known each other before their ideological split, having worked together in the past, and debated these very questions long before mutants became a headline issue. That shared history gave their rivalry a weight that a simple hero-villain dynamic never could have. Every confrontation between the X-Men and Magneto carried an undercurrent of two former friends arguing about the same unresolved disagreement, just with much higher stakes each time. That earlier friendship, revealed gradually across later flashback stories, showed the two men meeting as young adults, each shaped profoundly by very different formative experiences. Xavier's telepathy had given him an early, intimate window into the minds of people around him, and with it, a certain faith that understanding could bridge almost any divide if only people were willing to truly listen to one another. Magneto's childhood, surviving the horrors of the Holocaust, had taught him a very different lesson. That understanding alone had never been enough to stop those who chose hatred and violence, and that waiting for a persecuted people to be understood before they were allowed the means to defend themselves was itself a kind of death sentence. Both lessons were, in their own ways, true. Neither man was able to fully talk the other out of what his own life had taught him, and that impasse would define their relationship for the rest of their lives. It is this earlier friendship, more than any single battle between them, that gives their entire decades-long rivalry its particular emotional texture. Villains and heroes clash because they want incompatible things. Xavier and Magneto clashed because they wanted the very same thing, a safe and lasting future for mutant kind, and simply could not agree on the price the world would demand for it. Chapter 3. The Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Magneto did not operate alone for long. He assembled the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, a group that in its earliest form included Mastermind, the Toad, and the siblings Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch. Unlike the X-Men, the Brotherhood was not built around training or restraint. It was built around Magneto's belief that mutants needed to seize power and respect, rather than wait to be granted it. The presence of Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch in this early Brotherhood would matter enormously to later X-Men history, not because of what they did as villains, but because of what it meant that Magneto's own children would eventually walk away from him, choosing to become Avengers instead. Even in these earliest stories, Magneto's ideology was already showing cracks, not from Xavier's arguments, but from the people closest to him choosing a different path. Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch's decision to join the Avengers rather than remain loyal to their father's crusade planted an early seed of a theme that would echo across the entire franchise. Time and again, the story would ask whether Magneto's cause, however understandable its origins, was ultimately more about protecting mutants or about proving himself right. And time and again, the people who loved him most, his children chief among them, would answer that question by choosing a different path entirely. That tension between Magneto the ideologue and Magneto, the father, would resurface with even greater weight decades later, once the full scope of his family and the personal cost of his choices became clear. Chapter 4. The Sentinels. If Magneto represented the internal debate about how mutants should respond to a hostile world, the Sentinels represented the external threat that made the debate feel urgent. Created by the scientist Bolivar Trask, The Sentinels were giant robots built specifically to hunt, capture, and neutralize mutants. Trask's fear-driven decision to create them was itself part of the story's tragedy. A man so terrified of mutants that he built machines with the potential to escape human control entirely, which, in later stories, they repeatedly did. The Sentinels introduced a new kind of danger into X-Men stories, one that was not personal or ideological but systemic. A supervillain could be reasoned with, defeated, or occasionally redeemed. A Sentinel program was different. It represented institutional fear, the possibility that ordinary human governments and scientists might decide mutants as a whole were a problem to be solved, rather than individuals to be judged one at a time. That distinction between personal villainy and systemic threat would become one of the central tensions running through X-Men history for the next 60 years. The Sentinel's creator, Bolivar Trask, met his own end at the hands of his creations, when the very first generation of Sentinels concluded that the most efficient way to protect humanity from the mutant threat was to seize control from human authority entirely, including from Trask himself. This early twist established a pattern that Sentinel stories would return to again and again across the decades. Technology built out of fear tends to escape the control of the people who built it, and often ends up threatening the very humanity it was designed to protect. It was an early, blunt illustration of one of the series' most consistent warnings, that hatred, once given a mechanical body and enough processing power, rarely stays confined to its intended target. That warning would prove prophetic across the decades that followed, as later generations of Sentinels grew steadily larger, smarter, and harder to contain, eventually giving rise to the world-spanning threats seen in Days of Future Past, in Bastion's zero-tolerance campaign, and much later in the machine-driven extinction future that Powers of X would eventually reveal lying in wait at the very end of Moira MacTaggart's long, repeating timeline. Chapter 5: The Growing Mutant Threat. As the 1960s progressed, the X-Men's world expanded to include a wider range of mutant villains and rivals, each testing a different piece of Xavier's philosophy. Some, like the Juggernaut, Xavier's own stepbrother, complicated the idea of family loyalty. Others tested the boundary between mutant and human antagonism more directly, showing that not every threat to the X-Men came from fellow mutants, and not every mutant villain was driven by Magneto's ideology. By the end of this first era, the basic shape of the X-Men's world was established. There was Xavier's dream of coexistence, Magneto's belief that coexistence was a fantasy, the looming threat of anti-mutant technology and paranoia, and a small team of teenagers caught in the middle of all of it, being asked to prove, through their own choices, which vision of the future would win out. The Juggernaut's introduction, in particular, added a new wrinkle to Xavier's own personal story. Cain Marko, Xavier's embittered stepbrother, resented Charles for a childhood spent feeling overshadowed by his stepbrother's intellect and their father's evident favoritism. Cain's eventual acquisition of the mystical power of the Juggernaut, granted through an ancient gem discovered while serving in the military, gave him virtually unstoppable physical strength, and gave the X-Men their first recurring antagonist whose grudge against Xavier was entirely personal rather than ideological. It was an early reminder that not every threat to Xavier's dream came wrapped in Magneto's grand philosophy. Sometimes it came from far closer to home, rooted in nothing more complicated than old, unresolved family resentment. The book would soon change dramatically, but this early era mattered because it established the emotional and philosophical architecture that every future era would build on, reinterpret, or challenge. Xavier's dream, Magneto's warning, and a world not yet sure which one it believed. We'll continue with Part 2 shortly, following the arrival of a new generation of X-Men who would transform the series into something far bigger than anyone at Marvel originally intended. Part II: The New X-Men. The X-Men who emerged from this next chapter of the story bore little resemblance to the small, mostly American team Xavier had first assembled. What came next would reshape the franchise so completely that many readers today think of it as where the X-Men truly began. Chapter 6: Giant-Size X-Men and the New Team. By the early 1970s, sales on the original X-Men title had declined enough that Marvel had stopped producing new stories for it, instead reprinting older material. That changed with a single oversized issue that would end up reshaping the entire franchise. Xavier's original students were still present in the story, but they had been captured on a mission, and Xavier needed a new team to rescue them. Rather than simply reintroducing familiar faces, Marvel used the opportunity to build an almost entirely new roster, and in doing so, transformed the X-Men from an American teenage superhero team into something far more global and far more adult in tone. The new team included Storm, an African weather-manipulating mutant worshipped as a goddess in the region where she grew up before she ever met Xavier. It included Wolverine, a gruff, secretive Canadian operative with retractable claws and a healing factor, who arrived with almost no backstory at all, a mystery that Marvel would spend the next several decades slowly unraveling. It included Nightcrawler, a German mutant with a demonic appearance, a prehensile tail, and the ability to teleport, whose kind and devout personality stood in deliberate contrast to how threatening he looked. It included Colossus, a Russian farm boy who could transform his body into organic steel. It included Banshee, an Irish mutant with a sonic scream. And it included two characters, Sunfire and Thunderbird, who would not remain with the team for long, Thunderbird in particular dying in only his second mission. A shockingly blunt statement that this new X-Men book was not going to play by the safer rules of most superhero comics at the time. This new international roster changed the tone of the series almost overnight. Where the original X-Men had often read as a fairly conventional teenage adventure book, the new team leaned into complicated adult relationships, cultural identity, trauma, and morally ambiguous characters like Wolverine, who was openly willing to kill in ways the original team never had been. The book's writer and artists used this new freedom to slow down and develop character relationships in a way the earlier run rarely had room for, and readers responded. Over the next several years, this new version of the X-Men would grow from a struggling reprint title into one of the best-selling comic books in the country. Part of what made this new team resonate so strongly was how directly it reflected the mutant metaphor back through lived cultural and national difference, rather than relying solely on the earlier team's more implicit civil rights subtext. Storm's status as a revered figure in her home region, before ever encountering Xavier's American-centric worldview, gave the series a genuinely global perspective it had rarely explored before. Nightcrawler's devout Catholic faith, held alongside a demonic appearance that caused strangers to recoil from him on sight, dramatized the gap between inner character and outward appearance more directly than almost any X-Men storyline before it. And Colossus's quiet, dutiful loyalty to his family back in the Soviet Union added a layer of Cold War-era cultural tension that further distinguished this new team from its more insular predecessor. Chapter 7: The Rise of Wolverine. Few characters in Marvel history have been built as gradually and as effectively as Wolverine. When he first joined the new X-Men team, almost nothing about his past was explained. He was short-tempered, deeply skilled in hand-to-hand combat, physically able to heal from almost any wound, and clearly carrying some kind of violent history he wasn't willing to discuss. That mystery became one of the book's great ongoing hooks. Small pieces were revealed over years rather than issues. Hints about a secretive Canadian program, hints about a metal skeleton beneath his skin, hints about a long life lived under other names. The decision to keep so much of Wolverine's backstory deliberately vague for so long stood in sharp contrast to how most superhero origins were typically handled at the time, where a character's formative trauma was usually established clearly within their first few appearances. Wolverine's writers instead treated his past as something closer to an ongoing archaeological dig, doling out fragments only when the story called for them, allowing his healing factor and his violent competence to exist for years without any tidy explanation. That patience paid off enormously once the character's full history, stretching back over a century and touching everything from 19th century Canada to secret government programs to a long list of assumed identities, was gradually assembled, giving Wolverine one of the most layered and slowly revealed backstories of any character in the medium. Wolverine's popularity created a tension that would recur constantly throughout X-Men history, the tension between the team as an ensemble and Wolverine as a breakout individual star. Writers had to continually find ways to give him space to shine without letting the rest of the cast fade into the background, a balancing act that not every era managed equally well. But his presence also permanently changed what an X-Men story could be. A team that included a character willing to kill, when necessary in defense of his friends, could no longer be written as simple, uncomplicated do-gooders. Moral compromise became part of the team's identity, not just an occasional plot point. Wolverine's relationship with the rest of the team also modeled something the X-Men would return to again and again. Found family built out of people who had every reason to distrust one another. His gruffness masked a deep, if reluctantly expressed, loyalty, and over the years he became something like an older brother figure to younger teammates, particularly Kitty Pryde, whose friendship with him became one of the more quietly enduring relationships in the franchise. That capacity for connection, hidden beneath a violent and secretive exterior, made Wolverine far more than simply the team's most dangerous member. He became, in his own contradictory way, one of its most fiercely protective. His healing factor, beyond its obvious usefulness in combat, also gave the franchise a unique narrative tool for exploring trauma and memory. Because his mind could be tampered with far more easily than his body could be permanently harmed, decades of stories would return again and again to the idea of Wolverine's memories being erased, altered, or hidden from him by various government programs and enemies, turning a character defined by physical resilience into one whose deepest vulnerability was psychological rather than physical. That tension, between a body that could survive almost anything and a mind that had been violated and rewritten more times than he could ever fully reconstruct, gave Wolverine a tragic dimension that went well beyond his claws and his temper, and it helps explain why, of all the original New X-Men, his search for a stable, trustworthy sense of self would remain one of the franchise's most enduring long-term character arcs. Chapter 8: The Brood Saga. As the new team settled in, the series increasingly pushed outward into cosmic and horror territory, and the Brood Saga was one of the clearest early examples. The Brood were an insectoid alien race that reproduced by implanting embryos into other living beings, essentially converting their hosts into new brood. When the X-Men encountered them, several team members, including Xavier himself, were implanted, and the story that followed leaned hard into body horror imagery that was unusually intense for a mainstream superhero comic of that era. The arc mattered less for any single plot twist and more for demonstrating how far this new version of the X-Men was willing to go, tonally and thematically, compared to typical team books of the time. It also deepened the team's connection to the wider cosmic side of the Marvel Universe, a connection that would become central to the story that followed almost immediately after. The Brood's method of reproduction, transforming their hosts from the inside out into new members of their own species, worked as a particularly unsettling metaphor within an X-Men story specifically, since it inverted the series' usual language of mutation as something intrinsic and personal into something imposed, invasive, and identity-erasing. Several members of the team narrowly escaped fully transforming into Brood themselves, a fate that would have stripped away their individual identities entirely in favor of the hive mind's collective will, a fear of losing one's own selfhood that echoed, in a very different register, the deeper anxieties about identity and control that ran throughout the franchise's more grounded stories as well. Chapter 9: The Shi'ar and the Cosmic X-Men. The Shi'ar Empire, a powerful alien civilization ruled at various points by Emperor Dequen and later by his sister Lilandra, became one of the X-Men's most important recurring elements once the series began expanding into space. Lilandra, in particular, formed a long-running romantic relationship with Xavier, and her efforts to overthrow her unstable brother pulled the X-Men directly into interstellar politics. This cosmic connection wasn't simply a fun diversion from the team's usual Earthbound conflicts. It planted the seeds for one of the most important stories in the character's entire history, because it was during an encounter tied to the Shi'ar and a cosmic entity known as the M-Chron crystal that Jean Grey's connection to a force called the Phoenix first began to take shape. Lilandra's relationship with Xavier also gave the character a rare emotional life outside his role as mentor and strategist, offering readers glimpses of a man capable of romantic vulnerability, even as he carried the weight of an entire persecuted people on his shoulders. Her position as Empress of an interstellar civilization, constantly balancing the demands of governing with her feelings for a human mutant on a relatively minor planet, mirrored, on a cosmic scale, the same tension between duty and personal desire that so many X-Men characters would grapple with in smaller, more grounded ways throughout the decades that followed. Chapter 10: The Phoenix Saga. To save her teammates during a dangerous return trip through space, Jean Grey piloted a shuttle through a wave of deadly radiation that should have killed her. Instead, in a moment of crisis, she bonded with a cosmic entity called the Phoenix Force, an ancient, almost primal force of creation and destruction that exists across the universe. The bond gave Jean staggering new telekinetic and telepathic power, effectively transforming her from a strong psychic into one of the most powerful beings in the Marvel Universe. At this stage in the story, the Phoenix was still framed largely as an empowering transformation, a moment where a founding member who had often been treated as less central than Cyclops or Xavier suddenly became the most powerful person on the team. But the story's writers were already planting the idea that this kind of power came with risk. The Phoenix Force was not simply an upgrade. It was a force capable of overwhelming the person who carried it, and that tension between Jean Grey the person and the cosmic entity she now hosted would soon become the center of the most famous X-Men story ever told. Jean's newfound power also shifted the internal dynamics of the team in ways that mattered beyond the immediate plot. For years, Cyclops had operated as the team's default leader and most powerful active combatant, while Jean's abilities, though considerable, had generally been treated as secondary. The Phoenix Bond inverted that balance almost overnight, and the story leaned into the discomfort this created, both for Cyclops, who had to reckon with no longer being the most powerful person in his own relationship, and for Jean herself, who found herself both thrilled and quietly unsettled by a power that felt, even in these early stages, larger than anything she fully understood or controlled. The team had crossed into new territory, on Earth and in space, with a roster that finally felt like a true ensemble rather than a collection of archetypes. But the story was about to turn considerably darker, and the character at the center of that turn would be the same one who had just saved her friends in deep space. Part III: Dark Phoenix. The team had crossed into new territory, on Earth and in space, with a roster that finally felt like a true ensemble. But every gift the story had given Jean Grey was about to be tested in the harshest possible way, and the consequences would echo through the franchise for the rest of its history. Chapter 11: The Dark Phoenix Saga. Not long after Jean Grey returned from space bonded to the Phoenix Force, she and the X-Men were drawn into the orbit of the Hellfire Club, a secretive organization of wealthy, powerful figures who operated in the open as an exclusive social club, and in secret as a group of manipulative telepaths and strategists with their own designs on mutant power. Central among them was Emma Frost, the White Queen, a rival telepath who would go on to play a defining role in X-Men history for decades to come, though at this stage she was very much positioned as an antagonist. The Hellfire Club, led by Sebastian Shaw, targeted Jean specifically because of the power she now carried. Using psychic manipulation, they worked to suppress her sense of self and awaken something colder and more ruthless in her place, a persona that would come to be known as the Dark Phoenix. This wasn't simply Jean being mind-controlled into acting like a villain. The story presented something more unsettling, an attempt to strip away her restraint and empathy so that the raw, cosmic power of the Phoenix Force could operate unchecked, magnified by a psyche stripped of the very things that had kept it in balance. What followed was one of the most consequential storylines in Marvel history. Once fully transformed, Dark Phoenix's power spiraled entirely out of anyone's control, culminating in an act of destruction on a scale no X-Men story had ever depicted before: the annihilation of an inhabited star system, an act witnessed by the Shi'ar Empire, who considered it an unforgivable atrocity demanding the harshest possible justice. The X-Men were left facing an impossible question. Jean Grey, their friend and founding teammate, had committed an act of genuine, catastrophic destruction, even if it had happened while she was not fully herself. The Shi'ar Empire demanded her execution as the only acceptable resolution, and the X-Men fought to protect her, not because they excused what had happened, but because they refused to accept that Jean deserved to die for actions taken, while a cosmic force had overwhelmed and reshaped her mind. Lilandra's position throughout this crisis illustrated just how genuinely torn the story kept its own characters. As Empress, she bore direct responsibility for delivering justice on behalf of billions of her own subjects who had lost an entire populated star system to Dark Phoenix's rampage. As Xavier's partner, she also understood, at least intellectually, the argument that Jean herself had been a victim of manipulation as much as a perpetrator of destruction. The story never let Lilandra off the hook for this tension by making her simply villainous or simply sympathetic. She was asked to hold both truths at once, an impossible position that mirrored, on a much larger political scale, the same kind of impossible moral weighing the X-Men themselves were being asked to carry. The resolution came through Jean herself. In the story's climax, atop the moon during a ritual combat trial with the Shi'ar Imperial Guard, Jean regained enough control to recognize the danger she still posed if the Phoenix Force ever took hold of her again. Rather than risk that happening, she chose to take her own life, ending the threat permanently on her own terms rather than leaving that choice to anyone else. The Dark Phoenix saga became one of the defining stories not just in X-Men history, but in mainstream superhero comics generally, precisely because it refused an easy resolution. It did not blame Jean entirely, nor did it let her off the hook entirely. It sat with the discomfort of a hero causing real, irreversible harm, and it treated her final choice as a tragic act of responsibility rather than a simple villain's defeat. The emotional weight of Jean's death, and the complicated nature of the Phoenix Force itself, would echo through X-Men stories for decades, resurfacing again and again as writers returned to the idea that the Phoenix was never something that could be permanently contained or fully trusted. For Cyclops in particular, Jean's death became a defining wound that shaped his character for years. The two had been building a relationship since their earliest days as Xavier's students, and losing her in this way, watching her choose death over the risk of becoming an uncontrollable threat, left him carrying a grief that later stories would return to again and again, long before either of them could have guessed how many times Jean Grey's story would eventually loop back around through resurrection, clones, and time travel. The other X-Men carried their own versions of that same grief. Storm, Wolverine, Nightcrawler, and Colossus had all fought alongside Jean since the team's reformation, and her death was the first time this particular version of the team had lost one of its own so permanently, a loss that hardened the group in ways that shaped their willingness to make difficult, costly choices in the stories that followed. The saga also permanently changed how Marvel and its readers thought about the Hellfire Club. What began as a group of wealthy, secretive manipulators became, through Emma Frost and Sebastian Shaw especially, a recurring symbol of how easily institutional power could be turned toward exploitation, particularly of a young woman's mind and body, wrapped in the language of high society respectability. Emma Frost's own arc away from the Hellfire Club and eventually toward genuine heroism, culminating decades later in one of the X-Men's most important modern relationships with Cyclops himself, only makes sense in light of how thoroughly she started out defined by her role in Jean's manipulation and destruction. Part IV, Days of Future Past. Grief has a way of making people look forward as much as back, searching for some way to ensure it never happens again. It was in that spirit, still raw from Jean's death, that the X-Men found themselves confronting a threat that had not yet happened, and might never happen if they could only find a way to stop it in time. Chapter 12, Days of Future Past. Shortly after the Dark Phoenix saga, the X-Men found themselves confronting a very different kind of story, one that would introduce time travel as a permanent and recurring element of the franchise. In a possible future timeline, mutants had lost almost entirely. Sentinels, having grown far beyond their original purpose, now ran much of the United States as an occupying force, hunting down and imprisoning mutants in camps. Most of the X-Men in this future were dead. The few who remained were fugitives. This dystopian future traced its origin back to a single act of political violence: the assassination of the anti-mutant Senator Robert Kelly by a mutant terrorist, an act that public sentiment used to justify sweeping anti-mutant legislation and the unchecked expansion of the Sentinel program. In the original telling of the story, it was Kitty Pryde's mind that was sent backward through time into her younger self's body in the present, carrying the knowledge of this future with her, in a desperate attempt to prevent the assassination from happening and stop this future from ever coming to pass. Among the surviving X-Men in this grim future, Wolverine and Storm stood out as the hardened remnants of a team that had lost almost everyone else. Wolverine, in particular, had been transformed by decades of loss and desperate survival into someone even more grim and battle-worn than his present-day counterpart, a man who had watched nearly every friend he had ever made die at the hands of Sentinels he had spent his whole life failing to stop. Their presence in this future gave longtime readers a jarring, deliberately uncomfortable glimpse of who these characters might become if the fragile progress of the present were ever allowed to fully collapse. The older Kitty Pryde, who narrated much of this dystopian future, having survived into a version of adulthood defined almost entirely by loss, gave the story an emotional anchor that pure spectacle alone could not have provided. Readers experienced this bleak future primarily through her eyes, watching her grieve friends and teammates who, in the present-day timeline, were still very much alive, still bickering and training and falling in and out of love with one another, unaware of just how much was riding on choices that hadn't been made yet. That juxtaposition between the vibrant present-day cast and the grim, hardened future version of one of their own gave the story's stakes a personal, intimate weight that elevated it well beyond a simple robot uprising premise. Days of Future Past mattered enormously to X-Men history for reasons that went beyond its own plot. It established time travel and alternate futures as a permanent tool the franchise could return to again and again, always as a warning about where the current trajectory of mutant-human relations might lead if nothing changed. It reinforced one of the series' most persistent themes, the idea that fear-driven policy and violence tend to feed each other in an escalating cycle. And it introduced the Sentinels not simply as a recurring villain, but as a symbol of institutional overreach, a technology built to police a minority that eventually grows powerful enough to threaten everyone. The future depicted in Days of Future Past was never treated as inevitable. It was explicitly one possible outcome among many, a warning rather than a fixed destiny, and that distinction would matter enormously as the X-Men's world grew more complicated in the years that followed. But the story's imagery, mutants rounded up, imprisoned, and hunted by machines built specifically to eliminate them, became one of the most enduring and frequently referenced ideas in the entire franchise, a reminder of the stakes underlying every version of the ongoing argument between Xavier's hope and Magneto's fear. The story's structure, sending a consciousness backward through time rather than a physical body, also established a storytelling convention that later X-Men writers would rely on repeatedly, since it allowed characters to intervene in the past without the more complicated paradoxes of physically displacing themselves from their own era. It let the franchise use time travel as a recurring lens for examining consequence and responsibility, asking its characters again and again what they owed to a future they could not yet see, and what they were willing to risk changing about the present in order to prevent a catastrophe that had not yet happened. That framework would return in Messiah War, in Bishop's warnings during the Messiah Complex era, and eventually, in a far more structurally ambitious form, in Powers of X itself. Part V, the darker X-Men era. By this point in the story, the X-Men had already learned that victory rarely meant the end of a conflict. More often, it simply created the conditions for the next one. The team that entered the 1980s was no longer the same group of teenagers Xavier had first gathered in Westchester. They were seasoned, weary, and increasingly aware that the world they were fighting to protect did not always deserve, or even want, their protection. The stories that followed would test that awareness more directly than anything that had come before. Chapter 13, Mutant Massacre. As the 1980s progressed, X-Men stories grew steadily darker, and few events marked that shift as sharply as the Mutant Massacre. The Morlocks were a community of mutants living in tunnels beneath New York City, most of them physically marked by their mutations in ways that made blending into human society difficult or impossible. Led for a time by a mutant named Callisto, the Morlocks had largely chosen to withdraw from the surface world entirely rather than face constant persecution above ground. The massacre came when a group of assassins known as the Marauders, secretly assembled and directed by Mr. Sinister, descended into the tunnels and slaughtered dozens of Morlocks in a brutal, one-sided attack. The X-Men and their allies arrived too late to prevent most of the killing, managing only to save a handful of survivors. The story was notable for how unflinching it was. This was not a battle the heroes won. It was closer to a massacre they failed to stop in time, and several X-Men and allied characters were left seriously wounded, including Colossus's younger sister Illyana Rasputin's close ally Kitty Pryde, and the mutant hero Angel, who suffered wing injuries that led him down a dark path of his own in the years that followed. The sheer brutality of the Marauders' assault, carried out against a community that had deliberately chosen isolation over confrontation, marked a genuine tonal escalation for the franchise. Earlier X-Men stories had certainly featured death and loss, but rarely on this scale, and rarely aimed so specifically at mutants who posed no threat to anyone, whose only defense had been retreating underground entirely. The story forced its heroes and its readers to confront the uncomfortable truth that visibility and vulnerability were often two sides of the same coin for mutants who could not simply pass as human, no matter how far they withdrew from public life. The mutant massacre reinforced something the series had been building toward for a while, that not every threat facing mutants could be defeated through simple heroism, and that mutant society itself was fractured, with communities like the Morlocks existing entirely outside the protection or attention of teams like the X-Men, until tragedy forced the connection. The attack also reshaped several major characters for years afterward. Kitty Pryde, still a teenager during the massacre, was left with lasting psychological trauma from what she witnessed underground, trauma that informed her character's growing seriousness and resolve in the years that followed. Angel's wing injuries, sustained while trying to protect fleeing Morlocks, proved severe enough that he eventually lost his wings entirely, a loss that later contributed to his transformation into the darker, more dangerous persona of Archangel under Apocalypse's influence, a storyline that itself would ripple forward into the character's identity for decades. And the massacre marked one of the clearest early demonstrations of Mr. Sinister's reach and ruthlessness, establishing him as a figure willing to orchestrate mass killing in pursuit of his genetic experiments long before his full connection to the Summers bloodline and Madeline Pryor became clear. Chapter 14: Fall of the Mutants. In the story that came to be known as Fall of the Mutants, the X-Men faced a mutant supremacist adversary named the Adversary, whose destructive power ultimately forced the team into an extreme decision: faking their own deaths in the eyes of the world in order to stop the threat and prevent it from ever being fully repeated. Publicly presumed dead, the X-Men relocated to Australia and began operating in secret, a shift that reflected the growing sense that Xavier's original vision of public, celebrated heroism was becoming harder to sustain in a world increasingly hostile to mutants. This period pushed the team further from Xavier's founding ideal of proving mutant heroism to a watching, skeptical public, and further, into a mode of secretive, embattled survival, foreshadowing themes that would return again and again in later eras. The Australian relocation also marked one of the first times the series treated the X-Men's isolation from the wider superhero community as a deliberate strategic choice, rather than simply a consequence of circumstance. Operating far from New York, cut off from many of their usual allies and resources, the team leaned harder into self-sufficiency, and the harsher, more survivalist tone of this period bled into the stories that followed. Storm, notably, spent much of this era stripped of her weather-controlling powers entirely, having lost them during an earlier confrontation, and her adjustment to operating as a formidable hand-to-hand combatant despite that loss demonstrated a resilience and leadership capacity that would define her character for years, culminating eventually in her recovery of her full powers and her continued rise as one of the team's most trusted leaders. This harsher period also strained one of the franchise's quieter, long-running relationships, the bond between Kitty Pryde and Colossus, which had developed gradually since her earliest days as the team's youngest member. Their relationship, spanning a significant age gap that the books treated with varying degrees of care across different eras, had nonetheless become one of the more tender threads running through the team's ensemble dynamics, and the growing distance and danger of the Australian period placed real strain on a connection that had largely developed during gentler days at the Westchester mansion. Chapter 15: Inferno. Inferno was a citywide crisis centered on demonic possession and reality-warping chaos across New York, closely tied to the long, complicated history of the villain Mr. Sinister, and the New Mutants character Illyana, Rasputin's demonic connections through Limbo. While sprawling and chaotic in plot, Inferno mattered to the larger story because of how it tightened threads involving Madeline Pryor, a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to the deceased Jean Grey and had married Cyclops, unaware for years of the manipulations behind her own origin. The story revealed that Madeline had been created through Mr. Sinister's genetic manipulation, specifically as a clone of Jean Grey, engineered to draw Cyclops into a relationship and ensure the continuation of a bloodline Sinister had been secretly cultivating for generations. Maidline's own descent into villainy during Inferno, driven by the trauma of learning her entire existence had been orchestrated for someone else's purposes, gave the story an unusually tragic antagonist, a woman whose rage was rooted less in supernatural corruption alone, and more in the horror of discovering that her identity, her marriage, and her motherhood had all been engineered rather than chosen. The fallout from Inferno, and the revelations about Maidline Pryor's connection to Mr. Sinister's genetic manipulations, would ripple outward into some of the most significant Summers family storylines of the following decade, including the eventual introduction of Cyclops and Maidline's son, Nathan, who would grow up to become one of the most important characters in mutant history under a very different name. Chapter 16: The Morlock Conflict and Growing Divisions. In the years following the massacre, tension between different mutant communities became a recurring theme rather than an isolated incident. The X-Men were no longer positioned simply as protectors of a unified mutant people. They were one faction among several, with different groups holding different views on visibility, assimilation, and self-defense. This growing fragmentation mirrored real debates within any marginalized community about the safest and most effective way to survive in a hostile world, and it set the stage for a series later marked less by simple hero versus villain conflict, and more by ongoing arguments over strategy, safety, and identity within mutant society itself. Surviving Morlocks who joined the X-Men's orbit in the years that followed, including Callisto herself, brought with them a perspective the team had rarely encountered directly. The experience of mutants who had never had the option of hiding their differences, who had been forced underground not by choice, but by the simple impossibility of ever passing as human. Their presence complicated the team's own sense of what heroism and protection actually meant, since Xavier's model of proving mutant worth through public heroics assumed an ability to choose visibility that many Morlocks had never possessed in the first place. Part VIII: The Blue and Gold Era. The X-Men who entered this next chapter had already lived through cosmic fire, dystopian futures, and a massacre they had arrived too late to stop. What awaited them next was not a single dramatic event, but an entire decade of expansion, as the franchise grew larger and more complicated than it had ever been before. Chapter 17: The Expansion of the X-Men. By the start of the 1990s, the X-Men's popularity had grown to the point where a single team book could no longer contain the size of the cast or the appetite of the audience. Marvel responded by splitting the X-Men into two teams, commonly referred to by the colors of their uniforms, blue and gold, each led by a founding figure, Cyclops on one team and Storm on the other. This expansion allowed the franchise to run multiple ongoing storylines simultaneously, and gave many long-supporting characters room to headline their own adventures for the first time. This split also reflected a broader shift in how Marvel approached the X-Men as a commercial property. What had once been a single, relatively niche team book had become one of the publisher's flagship franchises, capable of supporting an entire line of interconnected titles. That commercial success carried creative consequences as well, since it meant more characters, more subplots, and more simultaneous storylines than any single team roster could realistically manage. A structural challenge the blue and gold split was specifically designed to solve. Chapter 18: The Growing Number of Mutant Teams. Alongside the core X-Men, Marvel expanded the franchise into an entire family of related titles. X-Factor, originally formed by the original 5 X-Men operating as a separate team, and later transformed into a government-sponsored group. The New Mutants, a younger generation training under Xavier, who would eventually evolve into X-Force under the more aggressive leadership of Cable. Excalibur, based in Britain and built around Nightcrawler Kitty Pryde, and the reality-warping mutant Phoenix imposter turned hero Rachel Summers, alongside British heroes like Captain Britain and Meghan, offering a distinctly different, often more whimsical tone than the increasingly grim main titles being published at the same time. Each of these titles gave the mutant metaphor new settings and new angles, while keeping the overall story connected through shared events and crossovers. X-Factor's original formation carried its own particular poignancy, since it reunited Cyclops, Jean Grey, Beast, Angel, and Iceman, the original 5 students, years after Jean's apparent death during the Dark Phoenix saga. Her return, engineered through a complicated retcon revealing that Jean herself had been in suspended animation, while a Phoenix Force duplicate had lived and died in her place, allowed the founding team to reunite under far happier circumstances than anyone could have expected, even as it complicated the emotional weight of her earlier death for many longtime readers who had spent years believing that loss was permanent. The transformation of the New Mutants into X-Force marked a particularly notable tonal shift, replacing a book largely focused on adolescent students learning to control their powers with a more overtly militarized strike team. Mirroring, in miniature, debates the wider franchise would return to again decades later during Schism. Cable himself, having arrived from a dystopian future timeline carrying both advanced technology and a hardened, soldier's worldview, embodied this shift directly, pushing his young charges toward a level of combat readiness that would have felt entirely foreign to the New Mutants' earlier, gentler incarnation. Chapter 19: The Rise of the X-Men's Major Factions. This era also solidified several factions that would recur for decades. The Hellfire Club continued to operate as a recurring source of political and psychic manipulation. Mr. Sinister's schemes, often centered on genetic manipulation, and his obsession with the Summers bloodline, deepened. And government-adjacent groups, walking the line between oversight and outright persecution, became a more persistent presence, reflecting the ongoing uncertainty about how official institutions would ultimately treat mutants as their numbers and visibility grew. Sebastian Shaw, the Hellfire Club's Black King, and the man most directly responsible for orchestrating Jean Grey's manipulation during the Dark Phoenix saga, remained one of the franchise's most consistently unsettling antagonists precisely because his menace was rarely expressed through direct physical confrontation. A mutant capable of absorbing kinetic energy and converting it into superhuman strength, Shaw preferred to operate through wealth, social influence, and careful, long-term manipulation rather than open combat. Embodying a particular kind of villainy, the X-Men found harder to fight than any Sentinel or supervillain, since his weapons were boardrooms and social capital rather than fists or firepower. Mr. Sinister's ongoing obsession with the Summers family, stretching from his manipulation of Madeline Pryor through his interest in Cyclops' eventual son Nathan, gave the franchise one of its most patient, long-game antagonists, a villain whose plans were often measured in decades rather than single storylines. That patience made him uniquely unsettling among the X-Men's rogues gallery, since his influence often wasn't fully understood until years after the fact, when seemingly unconnected events revealed themselves to be pieces of a much larger genetic design he had been quietly orchestrating all along. Nathan Summers' own story, once introduced, quickly became one of the more unusual threads running through this era. Infected as an infant with a deadly techno-organic virus, he was sent forward in time by Cyclops and Madeline in a desperate attempt to find a cure that did not exist in the present, growing to adulthood in a harsh future timeline before eventually returning to the present as the battle-hardened soldier Cable. That a single character could be simultaneously an infant in the present timeline and a grown, weathered warrior from the future became one of the more striking illustrations of just how thoroughly time travel had become woven into the fabric of X-Men storytelling by this point, a narrative device the franchise would continue leaning on for decades to come. Chapter 20: The Growing Influence of Magneto. Magneto's role during this period became increasingly complicated. At various points, he served as an antagonist, an uneasy ally, and even briefly as the headmaster of Xavier's own school, following a period in which Xavier stepped away and left Magneto, of all people, responsible for training a new generation of young mutants. This arrangement, however temporary and fraught, captured something essential about the two men's relationship. Despite everything, Xavier never fully gave up on the possibility of Magneto's redemption, and Magneto, despite his ideological opposition to Xavier's methods, never fully abandoned a shared belief that young mutants deserved protection and guidance. Their relationship remained, throughout this era, less a simple hero versus villain dynamic and more a decades-long argument between two old friends who could never quite agree, and could never quite give up on each other either. This period also deepened several long-running character relationships that would carry forward for decades. Rogue, whose uncontrollable power to absorb the abilities and memories of anyone she touched had long made physical intimacy nearly impossible for her, developed a complicated, slow-building romance with Gambit, the charming, secretive Cajun thief whose own hidden ties to the villain Mr. Sinister and a criminal organization called the Thieves' Guild added tension to a relationship already strained by Rogue's inability to safely touch him. Their bond became one of the most enduring romantic threads in the franchise precisely because it was built around an obstacle that could not simply be written away, forcing both characters to find intimacy and trust despite a literal physical barrier between them. Rogue's own origin, having permanently absorbed a portion of Ms. Marvel's powers and psyche during an earlier confrontation years before joining the X-Men, added a further layer of complexity to her character that the romance with Gambit brought into sharper focus. She carried, quite literally, fragments of another woman's mind and memories inside her own, a burden that made her power feel less like a simple superhuman ability and more like an ongoing negotiation with her own sense of identity. Her eventual, hard-won ability to gain greater control over her powers, allowing brief moments of safe physical contact, became one of the more quietly triumphant character arcs of the era, tied specifically to her growing self-acceptance and her relationship with Gambit rather than to any single dramatic battle or crisis. Meanwhile, Xavier's own extended family grew more complicated during this period as well. His illegitimate son from an earlier, largely unknown relationship, a young man capable of astral projection, was introduced and later grew into a major antagonist in his own right, adding yet another layer to the recurring theme of Xavier's personal life, quietly generating some of the greatest threats his students would ever face, a pattern that had already played out once with his stepbrother, the Juggernaut, and would echo again, far more catastrophically, with Onslaught. Part VIII, the 1990s. To understand what happened next, it helps to step back from the battle itself and look at what the X-Men had become by the start of the new decade. They were no longer a single team, but an entire extended family of titles and characters, spread across continents and philosophies, bound together less by a shared headquarters than by a shared, ongoing argument about what mutant survival actually required. That argument was about to be tested by threats unlike anything the franchise had faced before, threats that came not from a single villain scheme, but from disease, from alternate realities, and from the buried consequences of the team's own history finally catching up with them. Chapter 21: The Legacy Virus. Introduced in the early 1990s, the Legacy Virus was a mutant-specific disease that spread through the mutant population, causing escalating physical deterioration, and in most cases, death. Unlike a supervillain scheme or an external attack, the Legacy Virus functioned as a slow-moving, almost existential threat, one that no amount of heroism could simply punch its way out of. It killed off several supporting characters over the years it remained active in the books, and it reinforced, from an entirely different angle than the Sentinels or the Hellfire Club, the sense that mutant kind's survival was never guaranteed. Among the virus's early casualties was Ilyana Rasputin, Colossus's younger sister, whose death from the legacy virus predated her later, more mystically inclined stories and demonstrated early on just how personally this particular threat was willing to strike. Unlike a battle against Magneto or the Sentinels, where death, when it came, arrived suddenly and dramatically, the legacy virus killed slowly, forcing characters and readers alike to sit with a kind of grief that unfolded over months of story time rather than a single dramatic confrontation, closer to how illness actually moves through a family or community in the real world. The virus would eventually be cured, years later, through the sacrifice of Colossus, whose death in the process of releasing the cure became one of the more significant character deaths of the era, later complicated further by his eventual resurrection during subsequent storylines, a pattern of death and return that would become increasingly common for major X-Men characters as the decades went on. The legacy virus also carried unmistakable resonance with the real-world AIDS crisis, which had devastated communities throughout the 1980s while facing slow, inadequate institutional response. Within the story, the virus was initially dismissed by much of the wider world as a mutant problem unworthy of urgent attention, echoing the real-world pattern of a marginalized population suffering being deprioritized until it could no longer be ignored. That subtext gave the storyline a weight beyond its immediate plot mechanics, reinforcing the series' long-standing tradition of using mutant metaphor to engage, however imperfectly, with real social crises happening around its readers. Chapter 22: The Phalanx. The Phalanx were a techno-organic alien species capable of assimilating other life forms, and their invasion storyline served as the backdrop for the debut of a new generation of young mutants, who would go on to form the Team Generation X, while the Phalanx threat itself was resolved within its own storyline. Its lasting significance came from expanding the franchise's roster of young characters and reinforcing the ongoing need for Xavier's dream of mutant education and mentorship. Even as the world around his students grew more dangerous, Generation X's formation, following directly on the heels of the Phalanx crisis, marked a deliberate return to Xavier's earliest educational instincts after years of increasingly militarized storytelling across the wider X-Men line. Led by Banshee and the reformed telepath Emma Frost, now working to redeem herself following her earlier Hellfire Club history, the school this new generation attended emphasized structured learning and gradual, supervised development of their powers, offering a counterpoint to the more battle-hardened New Mutants and X-Force that had come to define youth mutant storytelling elsewhere in the line. Chapter 23: Age of Apocalypse. It's important to be clear from the outset. Age of Apocalypse did not take place in the main Marvel continuity. It was an alternate timeline, created when Xavier's own son, traveling back in time in an attempt to prevent his father's assassination, instead accidentally caused it, erasing Xavier from history before he had built the X-Men at all. Without Xavier, the ancient mutant apocalypse rose largely unopposed, reshaping the world according to his brutal philosophy of survival of the fittest. In this altered reality, familiar characters took on dramatically different roles. Magneto, in Xavier's absence, became the reluctant leader of a resistance movement, forced into the position of protector that Xavier would have normally occupied. Other familiar heroes appeared as villains, and vice versa, allowing the storyline to explore alternate versions of nearly the entire cast under drastically different circumstances. This alternate Magneto's arc proved especially compelling, since it forced the character to grapple directly with the very responsibilities Xavier had always shouldered: protecting the vulnerable, building coalitions, making impossible compromises for the greater good, all while operating in a world far more openly brutal than the one the mainline Magneto had spent his life warning everyone about. Watching Magneto genuinely struggle under the weight of Xavier's old role offered readers a rare, sympathetic window into just how difficult the choices Xavier had made across decades of mainline continuity actually were, choices that had often looked, from Magneto's usual outside perspective, disappointingly cautious or even naive. Age of Apocalypse mattered not because it altered the primary timeline permanently, but because of what it revealed by contrast. Seeing a world without Xavier, a world where Magneto was forced into leadership rather than opposition, threw into sharp relief exactly how much Xavier's specific presence, philosophy, and relationships had shaped the mutant world audiences knew. The timeline was eventually restored to normal, but the story left a lasting mark on the franchise, both in terms of its popularity and in terms of reinforcing just how fragile and contingent the ordinary X-Men status quo actually was. Chapter 24, Onslaught. Onslaught emerged from the psychic collision of Xavier's own suppressed rage and Magneto's ideology, following a traumatic confrontation between the two men in which Xavier, in a moment of fury, used his telepathy to essentially shut down Magneto's mind. The dark psychic residue of that act, combined with buried anger Xavier had never fully processed from a lifetime of compromise and loss, coalesced into an entirely new, immensely powerful entity calling itself Onslaught. The confrontation that produced Onslaught grew out of one of Magneto's most violent acts against the X-Men, an assault that included tearing the adamantium from Wolverine's skeleton, leaving him in agonizing, near-fatal condition. Xavier's response, an act of psychic retaliation severe enough to effectively lobotomize his oldest friend and rival, represented a genuine breaking point for a man who had spent decades preaching restraint above all else. That this act of overwhelming force, taken in defense of someone Xavier loved, was precisely the kind of decisive violence Magneto himself had always argued was sometimes necessary, added a bitter irony to Onslaught's origin. The entity was born from Xavier finally doing, however briefly, what Magneto had always insisted he should. Onslaught's rampage pulled in nearly every hero in the Marvel Universe, X-Men and Avengers alike, and its resolution led directly into a period where several of Marvel's most prominent heroes, including Captain America, Iron Man, and the Fantastic Four, were believed dead, having been pulled into a pocket dimension as part of the story's climax. For the X-Men specifically, Onslaught represented a disturbing culmination of the Xavier-Magneto conflict, suggesting that even Xavier's own repressed anger, left unexamined for too long, could become something as dangerous as anything Magneto had ever threatened to unleash. The event forced a reckoning that Xavier himself had spent decades avoiding. For all his insistence on peaceful coexistence and careful restraint, the psychic fury that fed Onslaught proved that Xavier was not immune to the same rage and trauma he so often counseled his students to control. It complicated his moral authority within the franchise going forward, making him a more human, more fallible figure, rather than the near-unimpeachable mentor he had often been treated as in earlier decades. Magneto, for his part, spent a significant stretch of time following Onslaught in a diminished, powerless state, having lost much of his power during the psychic merger that created the entity, a rare period of vulnerability for a character usually defined by his overwhelming command of magnetism. Chapter 25, Operation Zero Tolerance. In the aftermath of Onslaught, public and governmental anxiety about mutants intensified further, culminating in Operation Zero Tolerance, a sweeping anti-mutant initiative led by a mysterious figure known as Bastion, who combined human and Sentinel technology into a single, deeply personal campaign against mutant kind. Zero Tolerance escalated the ongoing Sentinel threat from institutional policy into something more targeted and immediate, directly endangering the X-Men and their support systems, including Xavier's own infrastructure and resources. The event reinforced a pattern that would recur throughout the decade and beyond. Each time mutant kind seemed to stabilize, whether through Xavier's efforts, alliances with human institutions, or simple public tolerance, a new wave of anti-mutant backlash would emerge to threaten that fragile progress all over again. Bastion himself deserves particular attention here, because he represented a new and more insidious kind of threat than the Sentinels alone ever had. Rather than being purely mechanical, Bastion was part human, part Sentinel technology, capable of blending into human institutions and manipulating them from within. He infiltrated law enforcement and government infrastructure, using legitimate authority to hunt mutants in ways that made resistance far more complicated than simply fighting a rogue robot. For the X-Men, zero tolerance underscored a lesson that would only grow more relevant in the years ahead, that the most dangerous anti-mutant threats were rarely the ones operating outside the law. They were the ones who had learned to operate through it. Bastion's persistence across the following decades, resurfacing again during Second Coming and later crises, reinforced his standing as one of the franchise's most durable symbols of institutional anti-mutant hatred, a figure who could be defeated in any single storyline without ever being fully eliminated, since the fear and infrastructure that produced him tended to regenerate in new forms almost as quickly as he himself could be destroyed and rebuilt. Part VIII, the New Millennium. Years later, another generation of readers would come to know the X-Men through a version of the team reshaped by everything that had come before: the Sentinels, the legacy virus, the alternate timelines, the slow accumulation of loss that had followed the team since its earliest days. The franchise entering the new millennium carried all of that history with it, and the stories that followed would increasingly ask what mutant kind's future actually looked like, not in some distant alternate reality, but in the world its characters were about to inherit. Chapter 26, The New X-Men Era. As the franchise entered the 2000s, a new creative direction reimagined the X-Men's world with a sharper, more explicitly political and metaphorical edge. Xavier's school was reframed more directly as an institution serving an entire people rather than a small found family of students. Formalized in name as Xavier's school became publicly known, and the concept of a broader mutant civil rights movement moved further into the foreground of the storytelling. This era also leaned into a broader, more visually diverse conception of what a mutant could look like. Rather than presenting most mutants as physically indistinguishable from ordinary humans, except when using their powers, the books increasingly embraced mutants whose very appearance marked them as visibly different, unable to blend into human society even if they wanted to. This shift sharpened the series' civil rights metaphor considerably, since it removed the easy option of passing, forcing characters and readers alike to confront prejudice aimed not at a hidden trait, but at something immediately, unavoidably visible. This period also brought a franker, more grounded exploration of mutant culture and youth identity into the storytelling, treating the school less as a simple training facility and more as a genuine community with its own internal social dynamics, cliques, and generational tensions. Students who had grown up entirely within a world that already knew mutants existed related to their own identities quite differently than the earlier generations who had needed to discover and hide their powers in isolation, adding a new layer of generational contrast to the franchise's ongoing exploration of what it actually meant to grow up mutant. Chapter 27, The Mutant Population Crisis and the Weapon Plus Program. This era introduced the idea that the mutant population, rather than growing indefinitely, had actually peaked and begun a slow decline, adding a demographic anxiety to the ongoing political and social pressures mutants already faced. Central to this shift was the destruction of Genosha, an island nation that had, for a time, functioned as a mutant homeland under Magneto's rule, home to millions of mutants who had relocated there seeking safety in numbers. That relative safety was shattered when a fleet of Sentinels, directed by a hostile telepathic entity posing as Xavier's long-lost twin sister, launched a devastating assault on the island, killing the vast majority of its mutant population in a single, brutal campaign. The scale of loss at Genosha, millions of mutants killed in a matter of days, dwarfed anything the franchise had depicted before it, and it permanently reframed how both characters and readers understood the stakes of mutant vulnerability going forward. Where earlier stories like the Mutant Massacre had shown dozens of deaths, Genosha's destruction operated on a scale closer to genocide, an explicit, unmistakable statement that the Sentinel threat the X-Men had been fighting since their earliest days was not hypothetical or contained, but fully capable of eliminating a mutant population numbering in the millions almost overnight. It also introduced, well before House of M, the demographic anxiety that would come to define so much of the following decade, planting the idea that mutant kinds' numbers, once assumed to be steadily growing, could in fact be catastrophically and rapidly reduced. It also expanded the history of the Weapon Plus program, the secretive government initiative responsible for creating Wolverine as Weapon X, revealing it to be part of a much longer, larger project with implications stretching far beyond any single character's origin. The Weapon Plus revelations recontextualized Wolverine's entire history, tying his creation to a decade-spanning, numbered sequence of increasingly ambitious super-soldier experiments, one of which, Weapon XV, was ultimately revealed to be a project aimed specifically at ending mutant kind altogether. This retroactively connected Wolverine's own violent origin story to the same institutional anti-mutant machinery the X-Men had been fighting since the Sentinels first appeared decades earlier, suggesting that the forces working to eliminate mutants were not a series of isolated threats, but pieces of a much larger, more coordinated pattern stretching back further than any single character had previously understood. Chapter 28: The Rise of Zorn and the Transformation of the Institute. A new mutant named Zorn joined the team during this period, introduced as a gentle, contemplative figure with a star contained within his skull. His eventual, shocking revelation as a Magneto impersonator, one who staged an attack on New York under Xavier's own school's name, marked one of the more controversial twists of the era, complicating the ongoing relationship between Xavier's legacy and Magneto's methods yet again, and leaving lasting scars on how the public perceived the X-Men's stated commitment to peaceful coexistence. The twist proved deeply divisive among longtime readers, since it directly contradicted an earlier, more sympathetic portrayal of the real Magneto elsewhere in the line, and Marvel would later revisit and reinterpret the exact nature of the Zorn impersonation in subsequent stories. Whatever the precise mechanics of the deception, the storyline's core impact remained significant. It planted a fresh seed of doubt in the public's mind about whether Xavier's own students and institution could truly be trusted, undermining years of hard-won progress the school had made toward broader human acceptance, and reinforcing just how easily that acceptance could be shattered by a single act of violence committed under Xavier's banner. By the end of this period, the X-Men's world had grown considerably more complex than its origins as a small superhero team. Population anxiety, institutional persecution, internal factionalism, and an increasingly blurred line between Xavier's and Magneto's methods had all become permanent features of the ongoing story. Genosha's destruction had already proven that mutant kind's numbers could be devastated in a single stroke. Zorn's deception had already proven that even Xavier's own school could be turned into a symbol of betrayal in the public eye. Both lessons would resurface, in far larger form, in the story that followed. Part IX: House of M. Every reinvention the X-Men had undergone up to this point had been driven, in one way or another, by conflict between mutants and the wider world. What came next was different. It would be driven by grief within the family itself, and it would leave a wound deeper and more lasting than almost anything an outside enemy had ever managed to inflict. Chapter 29, House of M. By the mid-2000s, Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, had suffered a series of devastating personal losses, including grief tied to children she had created using her reality-warping magic, children whose existence ultimately unraveled. That accumulated trauma pushed her into a state of psychological collapse, so severe that her chaos magic began to spiral entirely beyond her control, threatening the stability of reality itself. Wanda's history with the Avengers made her breakdown particularly painful for the wider Marvel Universe to witness. She had spent decades as one of the team's most trusted members, her own complicated origins as Magneto's daughter and former villain, long since set aside in favor of genuine heroism and deep friendships built across years of shared battles. Watching that same trusted friend become an uncontrollable threat, through grief rather than malice, echoed uncomfortably with Jean Grey's own transformation into Dark Phoenix decades earlier, reinforcing a recurring pattern within the X-Men's extended mythology. Some of the greatest threats to the Marvel Universe have come not from villains, but from beloved heroes overwhelmed by trauma too large for their power to safely contain. In an attempt to manage the crisis, Magneto, Wanda's father, along with several Avengers and X-Men, made the fateful decision to have her use her powers to reshape the world into one where mutants were the dominant population and Magneto's own family, rather than being estranged, ruled over a mutant-dominated society. For a time, nearly every major hero in the Marvel Universe lived within this altered reality, unaware that it was not the true state of the world. It was Wolverine, protected from the psychic effects of the altered reality because of his healing factor, who first began to recall the truth. As Wolverine and eventually other heroes worked to break through the false reality, Wanda's fragile mental state deteriorated further, culminating in one of the most consequential single moments in modern mutant history. Within the House of M reality itself, before its collapse, the story offered a striking glimpse of what a mutant-dominated world might actually look like, and the answer was not simply triumphant. Magneto's family ruled, but that rule was built on the same authoritarian instincts that had always shadowed his ideology, with humans relegated to second-class status and dissent crushed rather than debated. Characters readers knew as heroes occupied strange, often uncomfortable new roles, forcing an uneasy question underneath all the spectacle. Even if mutants achieved total dominance, would the world they built actually be any better than the one that had persecuted them? Or would it simply repeat the same cruelty with the power dynamic reversed? That question lingered well past the story's resolution, complicating any simple reading of Magneto's worldview as merely misunderstood. Even within the altered reality, cracks in the family's happiness were visible if you looked closely. Wanda herself, ruling as a queen alongside a husband and children conjured from her own grief-driven magic, experienced a fragile, artificial contentment that the story never let readers fully trust. Her children in that reality were, in a very real sense, the same children she had lost before the crisis began, magically recreated rather than genuinely restored. And the horror of that realization, once she finally understood what she had done, became as central to the story's emotional climax as the political fallout that followed. House of M was, underneath its sweeping political premise, ultimately a story about a mother's grief spiraling so far beyond her control that it reshaped the entire world in an attempt to paper over a loss that magic alone could never truly heal. Chapter 30, M-Day and Decimation. At the climax of House of M, having been confronted with her own destructive potential, Wanda uttered 3 words, deciding in an instant to strip the mutant gene from the vast majority of mutants across the entire planet, reducing a global population of millions down to a small fraction of its former size. essentially overnight. This event became known as M-Day, and its aftermath, the period spent grappling with a suddenly and drastically diminished mutant population, became known as decimation. The scale of what Wanda's 3 words accomplished is difficult to overstate within the context of the wider Marvel universe. No single act of violence, no Sentinel program, no genocidal campaign waged across 60 years of X-Men history had ever come close to reducing the mutant population so completely, or so instantly. Where earlier threats like the legacy virus had killed mutants gradually, over months and years, allowing some degree of adjustment and response, M-Day happened in a single moment, with no warning and no opportunity for anyone to prepare. Mutants around the world simply lost their powers all at once, often mid-action, mid-flight, mid-transformation, with no way to know in the moment whether they would be among the small percentage who retained their abilities or the vast majority who would not. The consequences of M-Day rippled through nearly every X-Men story for years afterward. Longtime characters who lost their powers had to grapple with entirely new identities. The X-Men, once fighting for the civil rights of a growing population, now found themselves fighting for the literal survival of a species reduced to a number small enough to feel newly, terrifyingly finite. The philosophical stakes of Xavier's dream and Magneto's warnings both intensified overnight, because the question was no longer simply whether mutants and humans could coexist peacefully. It was whether there would be enough mutants left for the question to matter at all. This sense of existential scarcity became the defining backdrop for the next several years of X-Men storytelling, shaping the tone, urgency, and central conflicts of nearly every major arc that followed, up to and including the arrival of a single mutant birth that the entire remaining mutant population would come to see as a symbol of hope. The human cost of M-Day extended well beyond statistics. Characters who had spent years defining themselves by their powers, sometimes as a source of pain, sometimes as a source of identity and purpose, suddenly had to reckon with an entirely different life. Some, like Richter, lost their abilities and had to rebuild a sense of self from nothing. Others found the loss compounded by survivor's guilt, having kept their own powers while watching friends and family lose theirs entirely at random. Xavier himself carried a particular burden here, since the crisis stemmed directly from a choice his own former ally Magneto's daughter had made, tightening yet again the long, tangled knot connecting Xavier's dream, Magneto's family, and mutant kinds, repeated brushes with catastrophe. Politically, M-Day also reshaped how mutants approached their own governance and self-protection. With the population reduced so drastically, the X-Men could no longer think of themselves as simply one faction among many mutant communities. They increasingly became something closer to a last line of defense for a species now small enough that every individual mutant's safety carried outsized weight. This shift in mindset, from protecting a broad population to protecting an endangered one, planted the seeds for the more militant, survivalist philosophy that would come to define Cyclops' leadership in the years immediately following, and that would eventually put him on a collision course with Wolverine during Schism. Part X: The Messiah Era. The mutant population had survived M-Day. What it had not survived was the fear that now surrounded it. Every mutant birth, every rumor of a child born with the X gene, carried a weight no ordinary child should ever have to bear, and the years that followed would be defined almost entirely by the question of who that child would grow up to be, and who would get to decide. Chapter 31: Messiah Complex. In the aftermath of M-Day, with no new mutants being born anywhere on Earth, the sudden birth of a single new mutant child became an event of civilization-altering importance. Multiple factions, including Xavier's X-Men, the Anti-Mutant Purifiers, and the Time-Displaced Mutant Soldier Cable, all raced to find and protect, or in the Purifiers' case eliminate, this child, who came to be known as Hope Summers. The Purifiers' involvement in this hunt gave the storyline a particularly chilling edge. since they were not simply another anti-mutant strike force, but a group driven by explicitly religious extremism, viewing mutant kind's apparent extinction following M-Day as divine judgment, and viewing the birth of a new mutant child as an abomination requiring immediate, violent correction. Their fanaticism added a disturbing new dimension to the franchise's ongoing exploration of anti-mutant hatred, one rooted not in fear of the unknown, but in a warped moral certainty that made them, in some ways, even more dangerous than more conventional threats like the Sentinels, since no amount of demonstrated mutant heroism could ever hope to change minds that had already convinced themselves of righteous purpose. The Messiah complex storyline marked a significant turning point in team leadership as well, with Cyclops, following disagreements over strategy and the direction of the X-Men, deciding to take the team underground and adopt a harder, more militant approach to mutant survival. Xavier, meanwhile, having been severely wounded during the conflict, largely stepped back from an active leadership role for an extended period, a shift that placed Cyclops more firmly than ever at the center of mutant leadership going forward. This handoff of leadership, from Xavier's more measured, diplomatic instincts to Cyclops's harder, more pragmatic wartime approach, marked a genuine philosophical shift for the franchise as a whole, not simply a change of who happened to be giving orders. Cyclops's decision to relocate the remaining mutant population to San Francisco and adopt an openly militarized posture reflected a hard-won lesson from years of external attacks, that Xavier's old model of quiet diplomacy and patient trust-building was no longer adequate protection for a species now numbering in only the hundreds. Whether this shift represented necessary realism or a dangerous departure from Xavier's founding values became one of the central, unresolved questions hanging over the X-Men for the rest of the decade. Chapter 32, Messiah War. Cable, having taken the infant Hope Summers into a dystopian future timeline to protect and raise her away from immediate danger, found himself and Hope targeted years later by Bishop, another time-displaced mutant who had come to believe, based on visions of a possible future, that Hope's survival would ultimately lead to catastrophe for mutant kind. The resulting Messiah War pitted Cable and a strike team of X-Force operatives against Bishop across a brutal future timeline, further reinforcing Hope's status as a figure whose fate carried enormous, almost prophetic weight for the future of the entire species. Cable's role throughout this period deserves particular attention, since his willingness to abandon the present entirely, raising hope alone across more than a decade of subjective time in a dangerous future, represented one of the more quietly extraordinary sacrifices in X-Men history. A soldier hardened by his own dystopian upbringing, Cable chose to give a child the kind of stable, protective childhood he himself had never been afforded, even at the cost of his own relationships, and standing among the present-day X-Men, a personal sacrifice that gave weight and humanity to a character often defined primarily by his weaponry and tactical brilliance. Chapter 33, Second Coming. Cable and a now teenage Hope eventually returned to the present, only to be immediately targeted again, this time by Bastion, who had assembled a massive anti-mutant strike force determined to eliminate Hope before she could, as many mutants believed, restore the mutant population. Second Coming became one of the bloodiest, highest-stakes X-Men events in years, resulting in the deaths of several significant characters and pushing the X-Men into an even more defensive, embattled posture. The scale of loss during Second Coming underscored just how dire mutant-kind circumstances had become in the years since M-Day. With the population already reduced to a few hundred individuals, every death during the conflict carried a proportionally devastating weight that earlier X-Men battles, fought when the mutant population still numbered in the millions, had never needed to reckon with in quite the same way. Bastion's strike force understood this arithmetic as well as the X-Men did, and the campaign was waged with the explicit goal of finishing what M-Day had started, an extermination effort aimed not simply at defeating the X-Men, but at ensuring no future mutant generation would ever exist to replace the one currently under siege. By the story's end, Hope had survived, and with her survival came the beginning of mutant-kind's long, difficult climb back from the brink of extinction that M-Day had created. But the years of constant external threat, culminating in Messiah Complex, Messiah War, and Second Coming, had left deep and lasting marks on the team's culture, marks that would surface explosively in the very next major storyline, when the X-Men's own internal disagreements finally became impossible to hold together any longer. Hope Summers' own journey through this era deserves particular attention, because unlike most X-Men characters, she spent her entire childhood and adolescence as a living symbol before she was ever allowed to simply be a person. Raised largely by Cable in a harsh future timeline specifically to prepare her for the dangers awaiting her, Hope grew up under the crushing weight of prophecy, aware from an early age that entire factions of mutants, human extremists, and time travelers all considered her survival or death to be the deciding factor in her species' future. When she finally did manifest the ability to mimic and amplify the powers of mutants around her, and when the Phoenix Force's return finally arrived, the pressure of that prophecy came due all at once, feeding directly into the events of Avengers vs. X-Men, and forcing Hope to grapple with an inheritance she had never actually chosen for herself. Part XIII Schism. The mutant population had survived Messiah Complex, Messiah War, and Second Coming. What it had not survived intact was the unity that had once let two very different men, Xavier and Magneto, coexist within the same movement despite everything that separated them. That same fracture, it turned out, could open just as easily between two of Xavier's own closest students. Chapter 34, Schism. Years of relentless external threats, culminating in Second Coming, had pushed Cyclops toward an increasingly militarized, survival-first philosophy for mutant kind, one that prioritized readiness for conflict above almost everything else. Wolverine, who had spent those same years growing more protective of the school's youngest, most vulnerable students, came to believe that Cyclops' approach was turning children into soldiers rather than protecting them. The disagreement came to a head during a confrontation with the Hellfire Club's youngest generation, when a battle involving a giant sentinel forced impossible choices on two young students in the middle of live combat. In the aftermath, Wolverine and Cyclops' long-simmering philosophical divide finally broke into open, permanent conflict. Rather than continue trying to hold a single unified team and school together under increasingly incompatible visions, the X-Men splintered. The specific battle that triggered the final break carried its own bitter irony. It was a new generation of Hellfire Club operatives, echoing the very organization responsible for Jean Grey's death decades earlier, who forced a group of students into direct combat with a rebuilt Sentinel, putting children in exactly the kind of mortal danger Wolverine had grown determined to prevent, and validating, at least in that single moment, exactly the kind of threat Cyclops had spent years preparing the school to face. Both men watched the same crisis unfold and drew opposite lessons from it. Cyclops concluding that readiness had barely been enough, Wolverine concluding that no amount of readiness justified exposing children to that level of danger in the first place. Chapter 35, Wolverine and the Jean Grey School. Wolverine took a significant portion of the mutant community, along with many of the youngest students, and founded the Jean Grey School for Higher Learning, deliberately naming it in honor of the team's fallen founding member and consciously positioning it as a return to something closer to Xavier's original educational mission, prioritizing safety, normalcy, and choice for young mutants above readiness for war. The choice to name the school after Jean carried its own quiet symbolism, tying Wolverine's new institution to the team's earliest, most idealistic era rather than to the harder, more militarized identity the X-Men had increasingly worn since M-Day. Under Wolverine's leadership, alongside longtime educators like Kitty Pryde and Storm, the school worked to give young mutants something many of the adults around them had never fully had themselves: the chance to simply be students first, and soldiers only if and when they chose to be, rather than by default. Chapter 36: Cyclops and the Revolutionary X-Men. Cyclops, meanwhile, established his own faction on the island nation of Utopia, adopting an approach that treated the ongoing conflict between mutants and a hostile world as an active, ongoing state of emergency requiring constant vigilance, and when necessary, more aggressive tactics than Xavier himself had traditionally sanctioned. This split placed the once unified X-Men into a lasting state of ideological division, echoing, in a new generation, the very same Xavier versus Magneto argument that had defined the franchise from its earliest days, only now playing out entirely within the ranks of characters who had once all called themselves X-Men. Utopia itself, an artificial island built from the wreckage of an earlier battle and anchored off the coast of San Francisco, functioned as a physical manifestation of Cyclops' underlying philosophy, deliberately separate from human society, defensible, and entirely under mutant control. Where Xavier's original school had been built to demonstrate mutant heroism to a watching human public, Utopia was built to need that public's approval as little as possible, a shift that, in retrospect, planted an early seed of the far more radical sovereignty Krakoa would pursue years later, even though Cyclops' methods and Xavier's eventual Krakoan philosophy diverged sharply in other respects. What made Schism particularly painful, rather than simply another team shakeup, was that both Cyclops and Wolverine were right about something real. Cyclops had watched mutant kind nearly be wiped out once already, and had spent years fighting a war he never chose in defense of a population that could not afford another Second Coming or another Messiah War. His insistence on preparedness was not paranoia. It was the accumulated lesson of a decade spent burying friends. Wolverine, meanwhile, had spent that same decade watching children thrown into combat again and again, and had reached his own limit of what he was willing to ask of students who had not chosen this war the way the adults around them had. Neither man was wrong. That was precisely the tragedy. Schism did not resolve the argument between Xavier's optimism and Magneto's realism. It simply proved that even two people who agreed on almost everything else could still be torn apart by how to answer it. Part XIII Avengers vs. X-Men. The division opened by Schism did not stay contained within the mutant community for long. It would soon draw in some of the most powerful heroes in the entire Marvel universe, and the cost of that wider conflict would be more devastating than anything Schism itself had threatened. Chapter 37: Avengers vs. X-Men. The division created by Schism set the stage for one of the largest crossover events the franchise had ever seen. As Hope Summers approached the age at which the Phoenix Force was prophesied to return to Earth and potentially bond with her, the Avengers, led by Captain America, grew concerned that Cyclops intended to weaponize that cosmic power for his own mutant agenda. Cyclops, for his part, saw the Phoenix's return as a potential means of finally reversing M-Day and restoring the mutant population, a goal he considered worth almost any risk. The resulting conflict pitted two of Marvel's largest hero teams against each other directly, and it ended in tragedy. The Phoenix Force, rather than bonding solely with Hope as expected, split and bonded instead with 5 X-Men, including Cyclops, initially empowering them as a seemingly benevolent collective. That benevolence did not last. As with Jean Grey decades earlier, the power of the Phoenix Force gradually eroded the restraint of its hosts, and Cyclops, the last host standing after his fellow bearers were defeated or lost their portion of the Force, ultimately succumbed to it entirely. The Avengers' distrust of Cyclops throughout this conflict carried its own long history behind it, rooted in years of watching mutant leadership repeatedly make difficult, often morally compromised choices in the name of survival. From the Avengers' perspective, handing a being of hope's importance, and by extension the Phoenix Force itself, over to a leader who had already taken the X-Men underground and adopted increasingly militant tactics felt like a genuine, reasonable risk rather than simple prejudice. From Cyclops' perspective, the Avengers' intervention looked like yet another instance of a more privileged, more broadly trusted group of heroes, deciding they knew better than mutants what was best for mutant survival. A dynamic uncomfortably reminiscent of the very paternalism Xavier's dream had always struggled against. Both readings had genuine merit, and the story's refusal to simply vindicate one side over the other gave the conflict a weight beyond typical superhero versus superhero spectacle. In the story's devastating climax, a Phoenix-possessed Cyclops killed Professor Xavier, his own mentor and father figure, during the final confrontation, an act that instantly and permanently altered how both fans and characters within the story viewed Cyclops going forward. Once the most devoted believer in Xavier's dream among the founding X-Men, Cyclops emerged from Avengers vs. X-Men as a fallen figure, his legacy forever complicated by an act of violence he had never intended and could not undo. The Phoenix Force was eventually contained, and its power ultimately used to restore the mutant gene to the general population, undoing the worst effects of M-Day and allowing new mutants to be born once again. But that restoration came at the cost of Xavier's life and Cyclops' reputation, leaving the mutant community simultaneously saved and shattered, a pattern of triumph paired with devastating cost that had, by this point, become one of the most recognizable rhythms in X-Men storytelling. The aftermath split the fandom and the characters alike over how to judge Cyclops. Some read his fall as a genuine tragedy, a man who had spent his entire life trying to protect mutant kind ultimately destroyed by the very power he'd hoped would save it, not unlike Jean Grey decades before him. Others saw a leader whose increasingly militant choices throughout Schism and the lead-up to the conflict had made some version of this outcome close to inevitable. The story deliberately avoided resolving that argument cleanly. Cyclops was arrested, tried, and eventually escaped custody, becoming a fugitive figure who would go on to lead a more radical, unsanctioned mutant revolution in the years that followed, a far cry from the dutiful, rule-following student Xavier had first recruited decades earlier. Wolverine, notably, emerged from the same conflict with his reputation largely intact, having fought against the Phoenix-empowered X-Men rather than alongside them, a divergence that deepened the rift between the two men first opened during Schism and left them, for years afterward, occupying opposite ends of the moral spectrum in the eyes of much of the mutant community. Part XIII, the Time-Displaced X-Men. Years later, another generation of X-Men would inherit the consequences of decisions made long before they were born, though not in the way anyone expected. Rather than simply living with the fallout of Avengers vs. X-Men, the franchise found a way to look its own history directly in the eye by bringing the earliest version of that history bodily into the present. Chapter 38, All New X-Men. In the aftermath of Xavier's death and Cyclops' fall from grace, Beast made a desperate, ethically fraught decision. He traveled back in time and brought the original 5 X-Men, Cyclops, Jean Grey, Beast, Angel, and Iceman, forward from their earliest days as students, hoping that confronting their future selves, particularly the man Cyclops would become, might somehow inspire a better outcome. Beast's decision carried heavy costs of its own. His time travel violated principles the X-Men had generally respected for decades regarding the dangers of tampering with established history, and his own deteriorating health, worsened by the strain of the journey, made the choice feel less like calculated strategy and more like the desperate act of a man running out of options and time both. The wider X-Men community's reaction to what Beast had done was sharply divided, with many characters, present-day Cyclops chief among them, viewing the entire endeavor as a reckless invasion of their younger selves' autonomy, rather than any kind of genuine solution to the crisis facing mutant kind. This time displacement created an unusual and emotionally rich dynamic. A teenage Jean Grey, unaware of her own death and rebirth cycles yet to come, unaware of the Phoenix Force's devastating future role in her life, existed alongside an older cast who remembered all of it. A young Cyclops, still idealistic and devoted to Xavier's teachings, had to reckon with the knowledge of the man he would eventually become, a fugitive blamed for his mentor's death. This premise allowed the series to explore identity, destiny, and the question of whether people are bound to repeat their own worst mistakes, all through the unusual device of characters meeting younger versions of themselves and their friends. The dynamic between young Jean and the rest of the cast carried particular emotional weight. Having grown up alongside the four boys as the only girl on the original team, this teenage Jean quickly found herself courted, in different ways, by both young Cyclops and young Angel, an echo of the original team's earliest, more soap-operatic dynamics now complicated by her awareness, gleaned from telepathically brushing against thoughts she wasn't meant to see, of just how much tragedy awaited her future counterpart. Rather than simply retreading old ground, the story used this awareness to give young Jean an agency her original self had rarely been allowed, as she actively worked to understand and eventually help manage the Phoenix Force's presence within her own psyche, far earlier than her adult counterpart ever had the chance to. Chapter 39, Battle of the Atom. The presence of these time-displaced original X-Men eventually triggered its own crisis, as visitors from a possible future arrived warning that the young X-Men needed to be sent back to their own time immediately, insisting that their continued presence in the present was actively damaging the timeline. This set off a complicated, multi-team conflict involving the present-day X-Men, the time-displaced originals, and future visitors, each with different, often conflicting ideas about what should be done. The involvement of multiple present-day X-Men factions in this conflict, still split along the lines drawn during Schism, gave the story an added layer of institutional complexity beyond the time travel puzzle at its center. Wolverine's Jean Grey school and Cyclops' more militant faction found themselves, for perhaps the first time since their split, forced into uneasy cooperation by a crisis that neither side alone could resolve, a small but meaningful sign that the wounds opened during Schism had not entirely severed the possibility of the two philosophies working together when circumstances demanded it. Ultimately, the young X-Men chose to remain in the present rather than return to their own time, a decision that added yet another layer of complexity to an already crowded mutant landscape, and one that reinforced a theme increasingly central to the franchise: the idea that no single vision, not Xavier's, not Cyclops's, not even a warning from the future itself, could simply dictate mutant destiny without the individuals involved having a say in their own fate. This decision carried lasting consequences for young Jean Grey in particular. Remaining in the present meant she would go on living alongside knowledge of her own future death and Phoenix-fueled transformation, a burden most versions of the character had only ever carried after already living through decades of experience first. Her choice to stay, fully aware of at least some of what awaited her, marked a striking departure from the fatalism that had often defined earlier Jean Grey and Phoenix storylines, positioning her as an active participant in shaping her own destiny, rather than simply a vessel for a cosmic force beyond her control. Part XIV, Terrigen and the Mutant Crisis. Mutant kind had rebuilt itself, slowly and painfully, in the years following Avengers vs. X-Men. But safety, as the X-Men had learned again and again, was never something that could simply be won once and then kept. The next threat to their survival would not come from a sentinel or a hateful crowd. it would come from another people entirely, one that had never intended any harm at all. Chapter 40. Death of X and Inhumans vs. X-Men. In the years following the restoration of the mutant population, a new and unexpected threat emerged, this time not from Sentinels or anti-mutant legislation, but from an unlikely source. The Inhumans, another superpowered offshoot of humanity whose own population had recently expanded dramatically across the globe. The Terrigen mist, the substance responsible for triggering inhuman transformations, turned out to have a toxic, ultimately lethal effect on mutants, slowly poisoning the Earth's atmosphere in a way that threatened to sicken and eventually kill mutants everywhere, including characters like Cyclops, who died as a direct result of prolonged Terrigen exposure during the death of X storyline. This discovery placed mutants and Inhumans on an unavoidable collision course. The X-Men, having only recently pulled their population back from the edge of extinction through the restored Phoenix-Dutch birth rate, now faced an environmental threat that was, in effect, a slow-motion repeat of M-Day, driven not by any single villain's malice, but by the unintended consequences of another group's own survival and expansion. The resulting conflict between the two communities was tense and often tragic precisely because neither side was simply wrong. Inhumans were not willing to stop existing to protect mutants, and mutants could not simply accept a slow poisoning of their entire species. The crisis was eventually contained, but it left the mutant community once again feeling profoundly unsafe, this time with nowhere obvious to place the blame. What made this crisis so uniquely unsettling compared to earlier threats the X-Men had faced was the absence of any clear villain to fight. Sentinels could be dismantled, Bastion could be defeated, even the Phoenix Force in its own way could eventually be reasoned with or contained. The Terrigen crisis offered no such target. The Inhumans releasing Terrigen into the atmosphere were not acting out of malice toward mutants. They were simply living their own lives, expanding their own population after centuries of secrecy, entirely unaware that the very substance central to their own identity was quietly poisoning another people at the same time. That absence of villainy made the crisis feel, in some ways, more frightening than any deliberate attack, a reminder that mutant kind's survival could be threatened by something as impersonal and unintentional as atmospheric chemistry. Cyclops' death during this crisis carried particular symbolic weight, given everything the character had already been through. Having fallen from grace after Avengers vs. X-Men, having become a fugitive and a controversial figure within his own community, he died attempting to warn the world about the Terrigen threat, a final act that many mutants and readers alike came to view as a kind of redemption. A man once blamed for Xavier's death, now dying in an effort to protect the species Xavier had spent his life trying to save. That redemptive framing would matter enormously when Cyclops, like so many X-Men before him, eventually found his way back from death during the Krakoa Era. Part XV, The Return of the X-Men. After so much loss across so many decades, something in the story itself seemed to be reaching for a different kind of ending. One by one, the dead began to come home. Chapter 41. Resurrection and Regrouping. In the years following the Terrigen crisis, several major X-Men characters who had died in earlier storylines, including Cyclops and eventually Xavier's own trusted allies, began to return through a variety of means, some clearly explained within their stories, others left intentionally mysterious at the time. Wolverine, who had sacrificed himself in an earlier storyline by allowing his body to be encased in adamantium to stop a techno-organic virus from spreading, also eventually returned, ending one of the longest character absences in the franchise's history. Wolverine's death and return in particular illustrated how much the franchise had come to rely on the emotional finality of death, even for a character famous for his healing factor. His sacrifice had been treated, at the time, as one of the rare deaths that would genuinely stick, precisely because it required him to consciously choose an end no healing factor could undo. His eventual return years later, engineered through a combination of old enemies and new science, was handled carefully enough to acknowledge that finality rather than simply erase it, with the character himself grappling openly with what it meant to come back from a death he had accepted so completely. This wave of returns, while individually satisfying to longtime readers, also reflected something the franchise itself seemed to be reckoning with. After decades of relentless loss, from the original Phoenix saga through M-Day through the death of Xavier himself, mutant-kind's story had become defined almost as much by grief and survival as by hope. The stage was being set for something that would attempt to answer that accumulated grief directly, not simply through another individual resurrection, but through a complete reimagining of what mutant survival could actually look like. Looking back across the decades leading up to this point, it becomes easier to understand why the franchise eventually arrived at a solution as radical as Krakoa's resurrection protocols. Jean Grey had already died and returned more than once. Colossus had died and returned. Xavier himself had died, and Cyclops had died, and Wolverine had died, each loss handled with real emotional weight at the time, and each eventually undone in one way or another as the decades wore on. Rather than continuing this piecemeal pattern of death and resurrection, story by story, character by character, Krakoa's architects effectively formalized what the franchise had already been doing informally for years, turning an inconsistent, occasionally frustrating storytelling pattern into a deliberate, structured feature of mutant society itself. Part XVIII, House of X and POWRS of X. Everything the X-Men had lived through up to this point, every Sentinel, every alternate timeline, every act of grief-fueled catastrophe, had been building toward a question none of them had ever quite been able to answer. What if the entire approach was wrong? What if trying to earn a place within humanity's world was never going to be enough, and mutant kind needed a world of its own instead? Chapter 42, House of X. After decades of persecution, near extinction, internal fracturing, and constant, exhausting conflict with the wider Marvel Universe, the X-Men's story reached one of its most radical turning points. House of X, released alongside a companion series called Powers of X, reintroduced Professor Xavier with a philosophy that represented a dramatic break from everything he had previously stood for. Rather than continuing to fight for mutants to be accepted within human society, Xavier proposed something entirely different: mutant sovereignty. Working alongside Magneto, a partnership that would have seemed unthinkable for most of the characters' shared history, and the geneticist Moira MacTaggart, whose own hidden history would prove central to understanding the entire initiative, Xavier established Krakoa, a sentient, living island, as an independent mutant nation. Krakoa possessed unique biological properties, including plants capable of producing miracle drugs that Xavier intended to trade with human nations in exchange for diplomatic recognition and legal protection, and flowers capable of resurrecting deceased mutants, provided their genetic data and consciousness had been backed up in advance. This resurrection protocol represented one of the single biggest changes to X-Men storytelling in the franchise's history. Death, which had defined so much of the emotional weight of decades of mutant stories, was no longer necessarily permanent for characters connected to Krakoa's resurrection process. This didn't eliminate stakes from mutant storytelling entirely, but it fundamentally changed their nature, shifting focus toward questions of identity, continuity of self, and what a society built around cheating death might actually look like, rather than the older, more familiar rhythm of loss and grief. Chapter 43, Powers of X. Told in parallel with House of X, Powers of X unfolded across multiple timelines simultaneously, jumping between the founding of Krakoa and the present, a near future in which Xavier's mutant nation had grown into a dominant global power, and a much darker, distant future in which mutants had been driven to the brink of true, final extinction by a human-machine hybrid organization called Orcus. Powers of X revealed that Moira MacTaggart possessed a mutant ability allowing her to be reincarnated with full memory of her past lives whenever she died, and that she had lived through this same broad historical cycle, mutants rising, human institutions responding with escalating violence and technological warfare, and mutant kind eventually being wiped out by machine intelligence multiple times before. Her partnership with Xavier and Magneto in this particular timeline was built on the desperate hope that a completely different approach, sovereignty and unity rather than integration and heroism, might finally break the cycle she had witnessed repeat itself again and again. Across her many prior lives, Moira had tried a striking range of approaches to averting the same eventual catastrophe. In one life, she had worked entirely outside the mutant community as a scientist, quietly trying to find a cure for the X gene itself, believing that removing the source of human fear might prevent the escalating violence she had watched unfold before. In another, she allied herself directly with anti-mutant forces, hoping to steer their efforts toward containment rather than extermination. In yet another, she supported Magneto's more militant approach without reservation, believing that only overwhelming mutant strength could deter humanity's worst instincts. Each life ended essentially the same way. Mutant kind's survival gradually eroded, until artificial intelligence, born from humanity's own escalating fear, and the arms race it produced, ultimately turned on everyone, mutant and human alike, having concluded that biological life itself was the true threat to be eliminated. It was only in this life, her 10th, that she chose the specific combination of Xavier's diplomatic instincts and Magneto's hard-edged realism working in genuine partnership, betting that the two philosophies might finally succeed where either one alone had always eventually failed. Together, House of X and Powers of X reframed the entire prior history of the X-Men, everything from the original team's formation through Dark Phoenix through M-Day through Schism, as part of a longer, larger pattern that Xavier, through Moira's accumulated knowledge, was now trying to escape entirely. It was, in a very real sense, the franchise looking back at its own 60 years of recurring tragedy and proposing a fundamentally different answer to the question that had defined it from the beginning. The philosophical shift this represented for Xavier personally cannot be overstated. For decades, Xavier's dream had been built around integration, the idea that mutants earning humanity's trust and acceptance through visible heroism was the only sustainable path forward. Krakoa rejected that premise almost entirely. Rather than asking to be accepted into human society, mutants under this new philosophy asked instead to be left alone to govern themselves, offering diplomacy and trade as the basis of the relationship rather than moral appeals to shared humanity. This was, in its own way, closer to something Magneto might have proposed decades earlier, and the fact that Xavier and Magneto were now standing together as co-architects of this new nation marked one of the most significant character developments in either man's long history. It also placed enormous, uncomfortable power in a small number of hands. The Resurrection Protocol depended on a specialized group of mutants known as the Five, including the Healer Elixir, the Reality-Shifting Egg, the Precognitive Hope Summers, the Reality-Warping Proteus, and the Time-Manipulating Tempest, whose combined powers allowed a mutant's most recently backed-up consciousness to be restored into a freshly cloned body. That process, extraordinary as it was, also meant that questions of who controlled the backups, who decided which mutants were prioritized for resurrection, and what happened to a person's sense of continuous identity across death and rebirth, became recurring sources of tension throughout the era, since the same institutions capable of conquering death were also, inevitably, capable of controlling it. Moira MacTaggart's role in all of this deserves particular emphasis, since House of X and Powers of X essentially reframed her as one of the most important and most carefully concealed figures in the entire franchise's history. Across her many prior lives, unseen by nearly every other character, she had tried nearly every conceivable approach to preventing mutant kind's extinction, allying with humans, opposing mutants, curing the X gene entirely in one especially bleak lifetime, and watching each attempt fail in its own particular way. Her decision in this life to conceal her true nature even from Xavier and Magneto for years, revealing it only gradually as trust was built, reflected the hard-won caution of someone who had already watched hope curdle into catastrophe more times than anyone else in the story could imagine. Part XVIII, the Krakoa Era. The mutant nation had been founded. Now came the harder work, actually building a society out of a people who had spent 60 years defined primarily by conflict, survival, and loss. What followed was less a single storyline than an ongoing experiment, played out across years of interconnected titles, testing whether an entire civilization could actually be built on top of so much accumulated grief, and what that civilization would look like once the initial excitement of its founding gave way to the slower, harder business of daily governance. Chapter 44: The Dawn of X and the Founding of a Nation. With Krakoa established, nearly every mutant in the Marvel Universe, heroes and former villains alike, was invited to relocate to the island, an offer extended even to longtime adversaries like Sabretooth and Mr. Sinister, under the reasoning that mutant unity mattered more than old grievances. This inclusiveness was itself controversial within the story, forcing characters and readers alike to grapple with whether survival justified uneasy alliances with figures responsible for real atrocities against mutants and humans both. Xavier, Magneto, and a rotating council of powerful mutants governed Krakoa through a body known as the Quiet Council, essentially the island's ruling government, which included figures from across the franchise's history, from founding members to former villains to relatively new characters elevated to positions of real political power for the first time. The decision to seat figures like Sabretooth and Mr. Sinister on equal footing with longtime heroes forced an especially uncomfortable reckoning for characters who had personally suffered at their hands. Wolverine, whose history with Sabretooth stretched back through decades of genuine trauma and violence, found himself forced to sit across the same governing table from his old tormentor, an arrangement that Krakoa's leadership justified through the island's founding principle that no mutant, however compromised their past, should be left outside the protection of mutant unity. Whether that principle represented genuine moral progress or a troubling erasure of real harm done to real victims remained a live question throughout the era, one the books never fully resolved and in many ways were not designed to resolve. Chapter 45: The Hellfire Trading Company and the Hellfire Gala. Krakoa's economic power flowed largely through the Hellfire Trading Company, led by Emma Frost, Sebastian Shaw, and Kate Pryde, formerly known as Kitty, which controlled the distribution of Krakoa's miracle drugs to the outside world, giving mutant kind, for the first time in its history, genuine economic leverage over human nations desperate for the medical breakthroughs only Krakoa could provide. Each year, Krakoa held the Hellfire Gala, an extravagant diplomatic and social event blending superhero action with high society political maneuvering, where major policy decisions, character developments, and status quo shifts across the mutant line were frequently revealed. The gala became one of the signature storytelling devices of the era, a recurring showcase of Krakoa functioning simultaneously as a nation, a culture, and a stage for its own internal political drama. The Hellfire Trading Company's leadership, drawing together Emma Frost's decades of experience navigating wealth and manipulation, Sebastian Shaw's own long history within the Hellfire Club, and Kate Pryde's more grounded, working-class perspective as someone who had grown up outside that world of inherited privilege, created a deliberately uneasy balance of power at the heart of Krakoa's economy. That the franchise's oldest symbol of exploitative, secretive wealth had been repurposed into the literal engine of mutant sovereignty was itself one of the era's more pointed ironies, forcing readers to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that the tools of power, once wielded by mutants for mutants, might look uncomfortably similar to the tools that had once been used against them. Chapter 46, X of Swords. X of Swords was a major crossover event centered on Otherworld, a mystical realm connected to Krakoa through ancient pathways, where the X-Men and their allies were drawn into a tournament-style conflict against the Swordbearers of Amenth, a demonic hostile realm whose ruler sought to invade Krakoa itself. The event deepened Krakoa's mystical and mythological dimensions, expanding the island nation's story beyond politics and science into something closer to a fantasy epic, while introducing new alliances and rivalries that would continue to shape the Quiet Council's internal dynamics. The story also gave particular focus to Apocalypse, whose long history as one of the X-Men's oldest and most dangerous adversaries took on new dimensions once he became a founding member of the Quiet Council himself. Revealed to have deep, ancient ties to Otherworld and Amenth stretching back centuries before Krakoa's founding, Apocalypse's participation in X of Swords underscored just how thoroughly the Krakoa Era had repositioned the franchise's villains as complicated, occasionally sympathetic stakeholders in mutant survival, rather than simple obstacles for heroes to overcome. The tournament structure of X of Swords also gave the event room to explore a wide range of characters through individual, high-stakes duels, offering focused spotlight moments for figures who might otherwise have been lost in the shuffle of Krakoa's increasingly crowded ensemble cast. Storm's own duel against a rival warrior, in particular, tied her ancient claim to a mystical blade back to elements of her pre-X-Men history in Africa, reinforcing threads of her character that dated all the way back to her earliest appearances decades before Krakoa was ever conceived. The event also deepened Krakoa's ties to Excalibur, the Britain-based mutant team whose earlier incarnations had spent decades operating on the margins of the wider X-Men mythology. Under the Krakoa banner, Excalibur's connection to Otherworld and Arthurian mythology moved from the periphery of the franchise to its very center, giving longtime supporting characters like Betsy Braddock, who took up the mantle of Captain Britain during this period, a scale and significance in the mutant nation's story that earlier decades of publication had rarely afforded them. Chapter 47, The Trial of Magneto. When a young mutant was found dead under circumstances that appeared to implicate Magneto, the resulting trial of Magneto forced Krakoa's fledgling justice system to confront one of its founders directly, testing whether the island's promise of due process and genuine justice could hold up even when applied to one of its most powerful architects. The story ultimately revealed a far stranger truth involving Magneto's daughter, the Scarlet Witch, and lingering consequences from her own traumatic history. But the trial itself remained significant for demonstrating that Krakoa, whatever its flaws, was attempting to build functioning institutions rather than rule purely by the will of its most powerful members. The trial also reopened long-buried tension between Magneto and Wanda, whose relationship had never fully healed following the events of House of M and M-Day. Watching a father accused of harming a child, while his own estranged daughter's actions had once devastated the entire mutant population, gave the storyline an added layer of painful irony that longtime readers were well positioned to recognize, even as the newest generation of Krakoan citizens experienced the trial simply as a test of their young nation's commitment to justice. The trial's ultimate outcome, clearing Magneto of direct wrongdoing while exposing deeper truths about grief, magic, and the lingering psychic wounds Wanda carried from her own history, avoided the easy satisfaction of a simple guilty or innocent verdict. Instead, it reinforced a pattern that had followed Magneto throughout his entire life. Even when formally exonerated, the accumulated weight of his past and the ripple effects of the choices made by those closest to him meant he was rarely allowed the clean moral standing his co-founding role on the Quiet Council might otherwise have suggested. Krakoa's justice system, still young and still finding its footing, proved capable of reaching a technically correct verdict without ever fully resolving the deeper questions the trial had raised. Chapter 48: Inferno and the Fracturing Council. A second story to bear the name Inferno struck at the heart of Krakoa's leadership, revealing deep fractures within the Quiet Council, particularly surrounding Mystique's discovery that Moira MacTaggart's true nature and her manipulative role in Krakoa's founding had been deliberately hidden from most of the island's ruling body. This revelation, that the entire Krakoa project had been shaped in secret by a small inner circle possessing knowledge the rest of the council did not, introduced serious questions about trust, consent, and whether Krakoa's utopian promises had been built on a foundation of concealment. Mystique's discovery, and her subsequent willingness to use that knowledge as leverage against Xavier and Magneto directly, reframed her role within Krakoa society entirely. No longer simply a former villain granted amnesty, she became one of the era's sharpest internal critics, positioned to expose exactly how much of Krakoa's founding mythology had been carefully curated rather than fully honest. Her confrontation with Xavier and Magneto over Moira's concealed history forced both men, for perhaps the first time since the island's founding, to publicly answer for a decision they had made unilaterally on behalf of an entire species that had never been given the chance to weigh in. The wider Quiet Council's reaction to this revelation split along lines that echoed familiar fault lines from earlier eras of X-Men history. Some members argued that Xavier and Magneto's concealment, however uncomfortable, had been a necessary and pragmatic choice, given the fragility of Krakoa's early founding, a defensible act of leadership under extraordinary circumstances. Others viewed it as a betrayal of the very principles Krakoa claimed to represent, a nation supposedly built on mutant self-determination that had, in fact, been quietly steered from behind the scenes by two men who had decided on their own what the rest of mutant kind needed to know, and when they needed to know it. That disagreement would not fully heal before the era's eventual collapse, leaving a lingering distrust within Krakoa's own leadership that Orcus's later assault would only widen further. Chapter 49: Destiny and Mystique. Central to this unraveling was the long, tragic history between Mystique and her partner Destiny, a precognitive mutant who had died decades earlier, long before Krakoa's founding, and whose extensive prophetic diaries had been quietly hidden away and fought over for years by various factions eager to know what she had foreseen about mutant-kind's future. Krakoa's resurrection protocols raised an agonizing possibility for Mystique, the chance to finally bring Destiny back to life. The obstacles placed in her way, deliberately, by other members of the Quiet Council who feared what Destiny's prophetic knowledge might reveal or destabilize, became one of the era's most emotionally resonant ongoing storylines, a reminder that even within a supposed utopia, old grief and new power struggles could still collide. Mystique and Destiny's relationship had, in fact, been part of the X-Men story for decades, quietly present in the background of earlier eras, even when editorial restrictions of the time prevented it from being stated as openly as later Krakoa Era stories finally allowed. Seeing Krakoa's institutions repeatedly deny Mystique the one thing its resurrection technology should have made simple, reuniting with the person she had loved and lost long before the island nation ever existed, became one of the sharpest critiques the books offered of Krakoa's own stated ideals. A nation built on the promise that death no longer had to be permanent was, in practice, still capable of using that same power selectively, protecting some relationships and grudges while erasing others, depending entirely on who controlled the council's votes. Destiny's prophetic diaries added another layer of tension to this already fraught storyline. Written across decades before her death, they were rumored to contain detailed knowledge of mutankind's future, information powerful enough that multiple factions within and outside Krakoa considered controlling or suppressing them worth almost any cost. Xavier and Magneto's own reluctance to see Destiny resurrected stemmed largely from uncertainty about what she might reveal once restored to life, since her foresight had once extended to predicting details of Krakoa's own founding decades before it happened, raising uncomfortable questions about how much of the island nation's supposedly self-determined destiny had, in fact, already been mapped out by a woman long dead before the first Krakoan flower ever bloomed. Chapter 50: Krakoa as Civilization. Across these years, the Krakoa Era distinguished itself from nearly every prior period of X-Men history by treating mutant society as a genuine, functioning civilization, rather than simply a superhero team with a shared headquarters. The books explored Krakoan culture, including new naming customs and communal rituals. They explored Krakoan medicine, built around biological resources unavailable anywhere else on Earth. They explored Krakoan diplomacy, as the island navigated complicated, often hostile relationships with human governments who both needed and feared what Krakoa represented. They explored Krakoan economics, as the island's monopoly on miracle drugs became both a source of genuine power and a constant target for sabotage and manipulation by outside forces. And they explored Krakoan politics directly, through the ongoing maneuvering, alliances, and rivalries within the Quiet Council itself. This depth of world building gave individual characters room to explore facets of mutant life the franchise had rarely had space for previously. Storylines examined what Krakoan citizenship actually meant on a daily basis, from communal living arrangements to new forms of Krakoan law enforcement to the practical logistics of housing and integrating a population drawn from dozens of different countries, cultures, and generations of X-Men history all at once. Younger mutants who had grown up entirely within the Krakoan system, never having known a world without the island's protection, offered a generational contrast to older characters who remembered decades of persecution predating Krakoa's founding, adding yet another layer of internal division and perspective to an already complicated society. Krakoa's legal system was built around a small set of foundational laws, chief among them a strict prohibition against killing another mutant, a rule enforced with severe consequences precisely because it addressed one of the deepest wounds in mutant history, the long, painful legacy of mutants harming and killing one another under manipulation, desperation, or ideological conflict across decades of prior stories. That a society built by former enemies like Xavier, Magneto, Apocalypse, and Mr. Sinister would organize its entire legal foundation around protecting mutant life from other mutants, rather than primarily from outside threats, said a great deal about which dangers Krakoa's architects considered most urgent to guard against. Looming over all of this, quietly at first and then with growing urgency, was Orcus, the secretive human-machine organization first glimpsed in Powers of X's darkest future timeline, now operating in the present, watching Krakoa's rise with growing alarm, and slowly building toward the very extinction-level threat that Moira MacTaggert had lived through and tried desperately to prevent so many times before. Krakoa's social experiment extended into deeply personal territory as well. The island encouraged mutants to abandon many of the surnames and identities given to them by human society, embracing new naming customs rooted in Krakoan language and culture instead. Old rivalries were, at least officially, set aside in the name of species-wide survival, which meant readers watched former victims of Sabretooth's violence living, working, and governing alongside him, an uneasy coexistence that the books never pretended was fully comfortable, even as it held for years. Emma Frost's rise to genuine political and economic power through the Hellfire Trading Company marked the completion of one of the franchise's longest character arcs, transforming a woman first introduced as part of the machinery that destroyed Jean Grey into one of the central architects of mutant sovereignty decades later. Krakoa's relationship with the wider Marvel Universe was never simple, either. Human governments needed the island's medical breakthroughs badly enough to grant it formal diplomatic recognition, a status that would have been unthinkable in nearly every prior era of X-Men history, when mutants were, at best, tolerated vigilantes and, at worst, hunted fugitives. But that recognition never fully erased the underlying suspicion and resentment simmering beneath the surface, resentment that organizations like Orchis were more than willing to cultivate and exploit. Krakoa had won, for a time, the kind of legitimacy Xavier had spent his entire life pursuing. Whether that legitimacy could actually hold, once tested by a genuinely determined and technologically sophisticated enemy, became the central question hanging over the back half of the era. Perhaps the single most philosophically significant consequence of Krakoa's rise was the way it reshaped how its citizens related to risk and mortality itself. For decades, X-Men storytelling had drawn much of its emotional power from the genuine finality of death, the sense that a fallen character's sacrifice actually meant something, because it could not simply be undone. Krakoa's resurrection protocols complicated that dynamic in ways the books explored with real nuance, rather than treating as a simple narrative loophole. Characters grappled openly with what it meant to fight, and even die, knowing resurrection was likely waiting on the other side, some finding a new kind of fearless purpose in that knowledge, others finding it strangely hollow, wondering whether courage still meant the same thing once death had been rendered, for many Krakoan citizens, a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent ending. Part XVIII Fall of X. For years, Krakoa had seemed to answer the question Xavier and Magneto had spent their entire lives arguing about. Then, in a single night, that answer was put to the test in the worst possible way. Chapter 51 The Fall of X. After years of Krakoa's rise, expansion, and mounting internal tensions, Orchis finally launched its long-anticipated assault. Striking during a Hellfire Gala, Orchis dealt a catastrophic blow to Krakoa's defenses and its sentinel-neutralizing capabilities, severely damaging the mutant nation's ability to protect itself, and effectively ending the sense of relative safety and stability the island had provided for years. In the chaos that followed, hundreds of Krakoan mutants were captured and imprisoned aboard Orchis's massive space station, subjected to imprisonment and experimentation that echoed the franchise's oldest and darkest fears about anti-mutant institutions. The choice to strike during the Hellfire Gala carried particular symbolic weight, since the gala had come to represent, more than any other single event, Krakoa's confidence and cultural triumph, a glittering annual celebration of everything the mutant nation had built. Orchis's decision to shatter that celebration specifically, rather than simply attacking Krakoa's more conventional defenses, functioned as a deliberate psychological blow as much as a military one, designed to prove to mutant kind and to the watching world that even Krakoa's most carefully cultivated image of strength and legitimacy could be violently undone in a single night. The fall of X scattered the X-Men and Krakoa's broader population into a period of crisis and improvisation, forcing various teams to operate independently, rescue captured mutants, and confront the reality that Krakoa's utopian promise, mutant sovereignty, safety, and resurrection, had not been enough to protect its people from a sufficiently determined and technologically advanced enemy. The dream that had once seemed like it might finally answer 60 years of accumulated grief was, once again, under direct and devastating assault. Individual X-Men responded to this crisis in strikingly different ways, echoing, once again, the franchise's oldest recurring debate. Some teams pushed for direct, aggressive retaliation against Orcus, arguing that half measures had already cost Krakoa dearly, and that further restraint would only invite further catastrophe. Others focused on quieter, more painstaking rescue and rebuilding efforts, wary of a full-scale war that might cost even more mutant lives than the initial assault already had. The Quiet Council itself fractured further under the strain, with long-simmering disagreements about transparency, leadership, and strategy finally boiling over now that the nation's very survival was at stake rather than simply its long-term ambitions. Part XIII, the end of the Krakoa Era. Every era in X-Men history has eventually given way to the next, and the Krakoa Era, for all its ambition and genuine innovation, was never going to be the exception. What remained to be seen was not whether it would end, but how, and what mutant kind would choose to carry forward from it once the dust finally settled. Chapter 52, The Final Conflict. In the concluding chapters of the Krakoa Era, the X-Men and their allies confronted Orcus directly in a climactic struggle for the future of mutant kind, one that tested every institution, alliance, and relationship the island nation had built over the preceding years. Without detailing every specific twist of this still recent conclusion, it's enough to say that the Krakoa Era did not end quietly. It ended the way most major turning points in X-Men history have ended, with real cost, real loss, and a mutant population once again forced to reckon with exactly how fragile even their most ambitious attempts at safety and sovereignty had turned out to be. What made this ending distinct from earlier catastrophes, like M-Day or the fall of Xavier during Avengers vs. X-Men, was the sheer scale of what had been built before it collapsed. Krakoa had not simply been a headquarters or a temporary safe haven. It had been a fully realized civilization, complete with its own government, economy, culture, and even its own answer to death itself. Its unraveling, therefore, carried a different kind of weight than earlier losses, closer to watching an entire nation fall than watching a single battle lost, and the political, economic, and emotional aftershocks of that collapse would inevitably shape mutant storytelling for years to come, much as M-Day's aftershocks had shaped the era that followed it 2 decades earlier. What emerged from the wreckage was not a simple return to the world as it had existed before Krakoa. Too much had changed, structurally and emotionally, for mutant kind to simply go back to the status quo of earlier decades. Instead, the ending of this era set the stage for yet another reinvention, the latest in a pattern the X-Men have now repeated for 60 years. Rise, conflict, devastating loss, and eventually a new attempt to answer the same enduring question in a new way. For characters who had lived through the entire arc of Krakoa's rise and fall, the ending carried a particular kind of exhaustion that felt distinct even from earlier losses like M-Day. Xavier and Magneto, having spent years as genuine partners for the first time in their long, complicated history, were forced once again to reckon with the limits of even their combined vision. Younger mutants who had grown up entirely within Krakoa's protection now faced, for the first time, a world without the safety net that had defined their entire lives, an experience uncomfortably similar to what earlier generations of mutants had lived through during the decades before Krakoa existed at all. That generational echo of a new group of mutants discovering the same vulnerability their predecessors had known all too well gave the era's conclusion a somber, cyclical resonance that fit naturally within everything this documentary has traced so far. And yet, even in the wreckage, something persisted that had persisted through every earlier collapse as well. The X-Men themselves, whoever happened to be wearing that name at any given moment, kept choosing to stand back up. Not because the world had finally proven safe, and not because Xavier's dream or Magneto's warnings had finally been vindicated once and for all, but simply because the alternative, giving up entirely on the idea that mutants deserved a future worth building, had never actually been an option any of them were willing to accept. Krakoa's fall did not end that impulse. It simply meant the next chapter of it, whatever shape it eventually took, was still waiting to be written. Part XX: What the X-Men Have Become. Stepping back from the details of any single storyline, it's worth taking a moment to look at the overall shape of everything we've just traced. The X-Men began as a small, almost quaint team of teenagers, gathered by a hopeful telepath who believed heroism could change public opinion one grateful headline at a time. That was never the whole story, even in the earliest issues, but it was the story's starting point. A team, a school, a dream. It is easy, sitting this close to the end of such a long story, to forget just how modest that starting point actually was. 5 students, 1 mansion, a single, quietly stubborn belief that the world could eventually be persuaded, one act of heroism at a time, to make room for people it did not yet understand. Nothing about that original premise demanded the scale of everything that followed. And yet, decade after decade, the story kept finding new reasons to grow larger, new crises that demanded a bigger canvas, new generations of characters willing to carry the weight of an ever-expanding mythology. That the small, hopeful premise Xavier began with could eventually stretch to encompass cosmic entities, alternate timelines, and an entire sovereign nation says less about any single writer's ambition than about how genuinely durable the underlying idea turned out to be. That dream did not survive contact with the following 6 decades unchanged. Piece by piece, story by story, the X-Men transformed into something much larger and much harder to categorize. They became a symbol of prejudice, standing in for every reader who had ever been judged for something about themselves they never chose and could not hide. They became a political movement arguing, sometimes literally on the page through Xavier and Magneto's decades-long debate, about the most effective way for a marginalized group to secure its own safety and dignity. They became, especially after M-Day, a species genuinely fighting for its own continued existence, a stake few superhero teams have ever had to carry for so long or so seriously. And most recently, with Krakoa, they became something even more ambitious, an attempt to build an entire independent civilization on their own terms, answerable to no one else's fear or tolerance. It is worth pausing, too, on just how many individual lives this larger story was built out of. Jean Grey, who died choosing responsibility over survival, and who would go on to be resurrected, cloned, and time-displaced more times than almost any other character in the medium, her story circling back on itself again and again, without ever losing its emotional center. Cyclops, who began as Xavier's most devoted student and ended, more than once, as a fugitive blamed for catastrophe, his arc less a straight line than a long, difficult argument with himself about what leadership actually costs. Wolverine, who arrived as a mystery wrapped around old violence and slowly, painstakingly, became one of the franchise's most protective and paternal figures, a man who spent decades learning to build rather than simply destroy. Storm, who lost her powers and found them again, who led with a calm authority that never depended on being the most powerful person in the room. Rogue, who turned an ability that isolated her into a defining kind of strength. Each of these characters lived through the larger historical currents this documentary has traced, and each of them gave that larger history its emotional weight, because none of it would have mattered nearly as much without people this fully realized carrying it forward. It's worth remembering, too, that this was never a story mutant-kind was allowed to write entirely on its own terms. Every era we've traced was shaped as much by outside pressure as by internal choice. The Sentinels were built by humans. The legacy virus emerged from forces beyond any single mutant's control. Even Krakoa's sovereignty, for all its ambition, existed only because human governments were desperate enough for its medicine to grant it recognition, a recognition that could be, and eventually was, tested by forces determined to take it away. Mutant kind's history, in other words, was never simply a story about what mutants chose to become. It was equally a story about what the wider world kept forcing them to become, generation after generation, in response to fears that were rarely fully examined and even more rarely resolved. Running underneath every single one of these transformations is the same unresolved question the very first issues quietly raised. Can humans and mutants coexist? 60 years of stories have never given that question a clean, final answer, and it's worth sitting with the idea that they probably never will, and that this might be exactly the point. Every time the X-Men's world seems to find a stable answer, whether through Xavier's optimism, Magneto's militancy, or Krakoa's sovereignty, something eventually arrives to destabilize it again. A sentinel program, a psychic collapse, a genocidal decree, an alien plague, a machine-driven extinction plot. And each time the characters do not simply give up. They reinvent themselves again and try a new answer to the same old question. Xavier and Magneto's relationship captures this cycle better than almost anything else in the franchise. Two men who met as something close to friends, who split apart over a genuine, irreconcilable disagreement about how the world works, who spent decades as enemies, allies, rivals, and reluctant partners, sometimes within the same single year of publication. Their argument was never really settled. It simply kept finding new forms, new contexts, and new consequences, echoed by the next generation in Cyclops and Wolverine's split, and echoed again in the uneasy alliance that built Krakoa in the first place. It's tempting, looking back across 60 years of this argument, to want a winner. Readers naturally gravitate toward wanting Xavier's optimism vindicated once and for all, or wanting Magneto's warnings finally taken seriously enough to matter. But the story has never actually offered that kind of resolution, and the more time you spend with it, the clearer it becomes that this absence of resolution is not a failure of storytelling. It's the entire point. Xavier's dream, taken completely at face value, has repeatedly proven too trusting of a world that keeps finding new ways to build sentinels. Magneto's warnings, taken completely at face value, have repeatedly proven capable of curdling into exactly the kind of domination he claimed to be fighting against, as House of M's altered reality made painfully clear. Neither man's answer, on its own, has ever been enough. What has mattered, again and again, is the tension between them, the fact that neither philosophy has ever been allowed to simply win without being tested, questioned, and complicated by the other. The same is true of the franchise's broader eras. The optimistic, integration-focused stories of the earliest years gave way to the darker, more embattled stories of the 80s, which gave way to the population-scarce urgency of the M-Day years, which gave way, eventually, to Krakoa's radical experiment in sovereignty, which has now given way, in turn, to whatever comes next. None of these eras got to be the final word. Each one answered something the era before it had left unresolved, and each one, in turn, left its own unresolved questions for whatever followed. That rhythm, answer and complication, has been the actual engine driving X-Men storytelling for 60 years, far more than any single villain or crossover event. Perhaps that's the real, quiet lesson sitting underneath 60 years of Sentinels, cosmic phoenixes, dark timelines, and fallen utopias. Hope and fear were never destined to defeat one another cleanly. They were always going to keep circling each other, reshaping the world between them, generation after generation. The X-Men story has never been about finally winning that argument once and for all. It's been about what a group of people, born different in a world not always ready for them, choose to do in the space between hope and fear, again and again, for as long as the story keeps being told. There's something worth carrying with you into sleep tonight in that idea. Most of us will never manipulate magnetism or read minds or heal from a mortal wound. But most of us do, at some point, live inside some version of that same tension, between the hope that things can get better and the fear that they won't, between trusting the people around us and protecting ourselves from them, between the world we wish existed and the world we actually have to navigate every day. The X-Men have spent 60 years dramatizing that tension on the largest possible scale, through Sentinels and cosmic fire and living islands. But the shape of the question underneath it all has always been a fundamentally human one. Whatever era of mutant history comes next, that question will still be waiting there for it, patient and unresolved, exactly as it has been since a small group of teenagers first gathered in a mansion in Westchester, hoping the world might someday be ready to welcome them. That's where we'll leave the story tonight, at the end of one era and the quiet beginning of whatever comes next. Thank you for spending this long, slow journey with the X-Men and the world they've spent 60 years trying to build. Sleep well.